On Christmas night, 1883, Clara Whitfield pressed her last coin into a child's frozen palm and told him to go home to his mother. She had nothing left, no money, no shelter, no man waiting at the end of the platform. The man who had promised to marry her had looked her over, turned his back, and walked away without a single word. Clara stood alone in the snow, holding an empty carpet bag, watching the last train disappear into the dark. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The depot at Caldwell, Kansas was near empty by the time the last passengers cleared the platform. A station master with a gray beard and an oil lamp walked the length of the boards, checking for forgotten luggage, when he nearly stepped over Clara Whitfield's foot. She had not moved in close to an hour. She sat on the edge of a wooden bench at the far end of the platform, her carpet bag between her feet, her hands folded in her lap so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The wool coat she wore was clean but thin, a teacher's coat made for cold classrooms, not open-air Kansas in December. Her dark chestnut hair was pinned back beneath a small bonnet that had seen better days. Her face was young and soft, with dark eyes that caught the light of the lamppost and held it. She was 24 years old, and she was by any honest measure a beautiful woman. She was also, by the judgment of nearly everyone in Caldwell, far too large to be beautiful. That was the word they used when they were being kind. Large. The women in the millinery shop used rounder words when they thought she couldn't hear. The men at the livery didn't bother lowering their voices at all. Clara had spent her entire life learning to carry herself as though those words belonged to someone else. She was doing that now, sitting straight, chin level, watching the snow come down across the tracks with the careful, steady expression of a woman who had decided some time ago that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of watching her cry in public. The station master stopped in front of her and held up his lamp. "Ma'am, train's been gone better than 40 minutes. "I'm aware," Clara said. "You are." He cleared his throat. "You waiting on someone?" She looked down at the carpet bag. "I was." He shifted his weight. He was an old man, not unkind, but not sure what to do with a woman sitting alone on a platform on Christmas night. "Well, there's a boarding house on Merchant Street, Mrs. Holt's place. She's decent enough, might have a room." "Thank you," Clara said. She did not move. He waited another moment, then walked on. She let out a long breath through her nose. His name had been Arthur Finch. He had written her 6 letters over the course of 3 months, each one more eager than the last. He'd described his farm, modest but stable. He'd described himself 31, widowed, church-going, looking for a woman with good sense and a kind heart. He had not in 6 letters asked for a physical description. She had assumed that meant he was the kind of man who didn't lead with appearances. She had been wrong. He had been standing at the end of the platform when she stepped off the train, holding a small bunch of dried wildflowers wrapped in brown paper. She had seen him look at her, had watched the expression on his face shift that particular sequence she knew by heart, the one that moved from recognition to recalibration to something she could only call a quiet, private flinch. He had put the flowers behind his back. He had said, "Miss Whitfield." She had said, "Mr. Finch, it's good to meet you." He had said yes, and then, after a silence that lasted too long, "I'm afraid I've had a change of circumstance. I'm sorry for your trouble." He had handed her the flowers anyway. She didn't know why. Perhaps because he was embarrassed. Perhaps because he had paid for them and didn't know what else to do. Then he had walked away. She was still holding the flowers. They sat next to the carpet bag, the paper already softening in the cold. A group of women passed the far end of the platform, heading toward the street, their arms full of Christmas packages. One of them glanced over, said something to the woman beside her. The second one looked too. Neither of them stopped. Clara kept her chin level. She had 31 cents in her coat pocket. She had a letter of introduction from the school board in Lawrence, which had recommended her for a teaching position in Caldwell, a position she had arranged to begin in January. She had a change of clothes in the carpet bag, a Bible, a small tin of salve, and the dried flowers that a man had handed her out of pity before walking away. She did not have enough for a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house. She had checked the rates before she'd left Lawrence. $2 a night. She had brought $3 total because Arthur Finch had written that he would be meeting her at the depot and that there would be no need for her to worry about accommodations. She had believed him. A small boy appeared from around the corner of the station building, moving fast, wearing no hat and a coat 2 sizes too big. He stopped when he saw her and stared with the frank, uncalculated honesty that only small children managed. "You been crying," he said. "No," Clara said, which was true. He studied her face as though verifying this for himself. Then he sat down on the bench beside her, apparently satisfied that the situation was interesting enough to warrant his company. He smelled like wood smoke and cold air. "Why are you sitting outside?" he said. "It's Christmas." "I'm aware. My mama says only drunks and dogs sleep outside at Christmas." "I'm not sleeping," Clara said. "I'm thinking." He considered this. "What are you thinking about?" She looked at him. He was perhaps 7 years old, missing a front tooth. Eyes that were direct and unsentimental in the way of a child who'd had a hard enough life to make him observant. "I'm thinking," she said carefully, "about what comes next." He nodded as though this was a reasonable answer. Then, "Are you hungry? I got a biscuit." He produced it from his coat pocket, slightly squashed, wrapped in a handkerchief that had seen better days. He held it out to her with a kind of uncomplicated generosity that made her chest ache in a way Arthur Finch's departure had not. She looked at the biscuit. She was hungry. She'd eaten nothing since the train's last stop at noon. But she said, "You keep it. You need it more than I do." He looked down at this biscuit, then back at her. Then he broke it carefully in half and set one piece on the bench between them. "Mama says sharing's not charity," he said. "It's just manners." Clara picked up the half biscuit. "Your mama sounds like a wise woman." "She's real tired," he said matter-of-factly. "Papa went up north for work and didn't come back." Clara ate the biscuit in 3 small bites. It was cold and dry and the best thing she'd tasted in hours. She was reaching into her coat pocket for the 31 cents, thinking she'd give the boy at least some of it. Thinking his mother must be nearby when she heard the sound of boots on the platform boards. Heavy, unhurried, the kind of step that didn't announce itself so much as simply arrive. She looked up. The man who stopped at the edge of the lamplight was tall, genuinely tall, not the way men sometimes seemed tall in dim light, but actually tall, the kind of height that came with broad shoulders and a frame that had been built by years of outdoor work. He wore a dark rancher's coat over a canvas shirt, a hat with a low creased crown that he didn't bother pushing back when he looked down at her, and boots that were worn but well kept. He had a face that could be called handsome, in the way of a man who'd never particularly thought about it. Strong jaw, dark brows, a few days of stubble, and eyes that were a shade of gray-blue that the lamplight made difficult to place. He was somewhere in his late 30s, maybe 40. He carried himself the way certain men did who had spent a long time being accountable for things larger than themselves. He looked at her. Not the way Arthur Finch had looked at her. Not the calculating, revising look of a man readjusting expectations. He looked at her the way a person looked at a situation they were trying to accurately understand. His gaze dropped to the half biscuit she was still holding, then to the carpet bag, then to the boy sitting beside her. "Tommy," he said. His voice was low and even. "Does your mother know where you are?" The boy Tommy made a face that strongly suggested the answer was no. "Go on home," the man said. Not harshly, just plainly. "It's cold." Tommy slid off the bench with the resigned compliance of a child who knew when an adult meant it. He looked at Clara. "Merry Christmas," he said. "Merry Christmas," she said. "Tell your mother thank you." He disappeared around the corner of the station building. The man remained where he was. He was not looking at her with pity, which she appreciated. He was not pretending he hadn't noticed her sitting alone on a platform at 9 o'clock on Christmas night, which she also appreciated in a different way. "You waiting on the morning train?" he said. "No," Clara said. A pause. You got somewhere to be tonight. She looked at him steadily. Are you asking because you're concerned or because you're curious? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. Bit of both, I reckon. She looked back at the tracks. The snow was coming down harder now. I had arrangements that fell through, she said. I'm managing. Doesn't look like managing, he said. Then before she could respond to that, I'm not trying to give offense, just making an observation. Your observation is accurate, she said. That doesn't make it less personal. I was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled off his hat, held it at his side, and said, My name is Daniel Kane. I run the Kane Ranch about 4 miles east of town. I came in to pick up a shipment that wasn't there. He paused. I'm sorry. That's not what matters. I'm telling you who I am, because I'm about to say something that might seem strange coming from a stranger, and I'd rather you know my name first. Clara looked at him. All right. The boarding house on Merchant Street, he said. Mrs. Holt. I know her. She's a decent woman and she's fair. If you need a room tonight, I can cover it. You can pay it back come January or not at all. I don't have strong feelings either way. But you shouldn't be sitting outside in this. She studied him for a long moment. She had been on the receiving end of enough charity in her life to know what it looked like on a man's face. The particular satisfaction of it. The slight elevation of posture that said, I am doing something good right now, and I know it. Daniel Kane's face didn't look like that. He looked like a man who had run the numbers on a problem and arrived at a logical solution and was now presenting it without fanfare. Why? She said. He put his hat back on. Because it's Christmas, he said. And because nobody should be sitting alone on a platform in the snow. That's not a reason, she said. That's a circumstance. He considered this. Fair enough, he said. Truth is, I know what it is to be the one sitting alone somewhere when you expected different. That's the reason. She looked at him. He didn't look away. She said, I'm Clara Whitfield. I'm a school teacher from Lawrence. I came here to meet a man who changed his mind when he saw me. She said it plainly the way she'd learned to say things that could hurt her, getting them out in the open fast before they could do more damage. I have 31 cents and a letter of introduction from the school board. I'm due to start teaching in January. I'm not destitute. I'm just temporarily without options. Something moved across his face. Not pity. Something quieter. All right, Miss Whitfield, he said. Do you want the room or not? She stood up. She was not a small woman. She knew exactly what she looked like, rising from a bench in a thin coat carpet bag in hand, and she had spent a great deal of her life either folding herself smaller to avoid notice or steeling herself against the noticing. She did neither now. She stood to her full height and looked at him directly. Yes, she said. I'll take the room, and I'll repay you in January when I receive my first month's salary. That's fine, he said. And I want to be clear, she added, that I'm accepting this because it's practical, not because I'm without pride. I didn't think you were, he said. They walked off the platform together and into the snow-covered street. Mrs. Holt was a stout woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and the manner of someone who had run a boarding house long enough to have a calibrated read on most of humanity. She opened her front door to find Daniel Kane on her porch at 9 in the evening on Christmas night, hat in hand with a young woman standing behind him in a thin coat. Dan, she said. Evening, Harriet, he said. This is Miss Clara Whitfield. She's a schoolteacher come from Lawrence, due to start at the schoolhouse in January. She needs a room for the next few weeks. Mrs. Holt looked at Clara. Her gaze was thorough, without being unkind, the assessment of a woman who had seen many things and was now adding this to the collection. You're the one who was supposed to marry Arthur Finch, she said. Clara kept her expression composed. Word travels fast. Arthur Finch talks too much for a man who doesn't have anything interesting to say, Mrs. Holt said. She stepped back from the door. Come in then, both of you, before you let all the heat out. The front room smelled like pine sap and something roasting. There was a fire going, and the warmth of it hit Clara in the face, like a physical thing. She hadn't realized how cold she'd gotten until she felt the contrast. Daniel paid Mrs. Holt 3 weeks' room and board, waved off the receipt she started to write, and turned to go. Mr. Kane, Clara said. He stopped at the door. She wasn't sure what she'd been about to say. Thank you seemed insufficient for a stranger who had just solved the most immediate problem of her evening without making her feel like a problem. You're a good man seemed presumptuous. She didn't know him well enough to say that. She had met him 20 minutes ago. She said, "Merry Christmas." Something crossed his face again. That thing that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood. "Merry Christmas, Miss Whitfield," he said. He put his hat on, stepped out into the snow, and was gone. Mrs. Holt showed her to a small room on the second-floor bed washstand window with a view of the backyard, a hook on the wall for her coat. It was simple and clean and warm. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, set the carpet bag at her feet, and placed the dried wildflowers on the washstand. She looked at them for a long moment. Arthur Finch had not looked at her face. He had seen the whole of her in one glance and made a decision in 3 seconds. 6 letters. 3 months of correspondence, the cost of a train ticket. All of it canceled out in 3 seconds by the fact of how she was built. She had known it was possible. She had known in the part of herself that kept careful inventory of what the world was likely to do to a woman who looked like her, that a man who had never seen her might not be prepared for what he found. She had told herself it was still worth trying. She had let herself carefully, and with considerable self-protective reserve, begin to imagine something different. She was not going to cry about it. She was, however, going to allow herself exactly 5 minutes to sit on the edge of this bed and be furious, not at Arthur Finch, who was small and cowardly, and ultimately not worth the energy, but at the whole arrangement of the world that made it so that a woman could be everything she was smart and capable and careful and kind and still have it count for nothing the moment she walked into a room. She gave herself the 5 minutes. Then she washed her face at the basin, hung her coat on the hook, and began making a plan for January. She met Daniel Kane again 4 days later, not by design. She was at the general store pricing paper and chalk for the schoolhouse. The previous teacher had apparently left midterm under circumstances. No one in town seemed willing to explain in full when she heard his voice at the counter, talking to the storekeeper about a grain order that had been shorted. "Third time this month," Daniel was saying, and his voice had that same quality it had had on the platform, calm and steady, but with a careful precision that suggested a man who chose his words because they were accurate, not because they were easy. "Supply chain's slow this time of year," the storekeeper was saying. "Can't be helped." "It can be helped," Daniel said. "It requires the supplier to do his job, which is a reasonable expectation when I'm paying for a service." Clara moved along the shelf, not wanting to interrupt. She picked up a box of chalk and examined it. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. Daniel had turned from the counter. He'd spotted her apparently without effort. The store wasn't large, but she'd been hoping to get her business done without drawing attention. "Mr. Kane," she said. He crossed the store in a few steps and looked at the chalk in her hand. "Getting the schoolhouse ready. Doing inventory first," she said. "Trying to understand what I'm working with." The previous teacher left rather abruptly. "Martha Connolly," he said. "Her mother got sick in Ohio. She had to go." "Did she leave under a cloud?" Clara asked. "Just under difficult circumstances," he said. "She was a good teacher. The children liked her." He paused. "They'll adjust." Clara set the chalk down and picked up a different box. "They won't want to at first," she said. "Children who've lost a teacher they trusted don't usually welcome the replacement." "No," he agreed. "They generally make it difficult." "I'm used to difficult," Clara said. He looked at her with that same quality of attention he'd had on the platform, the kind that assessed without judgment, that took in information without immediately reaching for a conclusion. "I expect you are," he said. There was a beat of silence. Not uncomfortable exactly. More like the silence of two people who were being careful not to move faster than the situation warranted. "How are you getting on at Mrs. Holt's?" he said. "Well," Clara said. "She's a direct woman. I appreciate that." "She is," he agreed. "She threw a man out last winter for smoking in the parlor, threw his luggage out the window after him." Clara permitted herself a small smile. Sensible policy. He almost smiled back. She'll be good to you, he said. If you're straight with her, she's straight with you. I intend to be, Clara said. He nodded once. He picked up his hat, he'd been holding it. She noticed since he'd turned from the counter, not putting it on, the way he would have if he'd been in a hurry and turned to go. Mr. Kane, she said. He stopped. Miss Whitfield. The children who are going to make things difficult, she said. Do any of them belong to you? Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of something she couldn't quite read there and gone. No, he said. I don't have children. I see, she said. And then because she was a woman who paid attention to the things that changed on people's faces. I'm sorry. He held her gaze for a moment. Much obliged, he said, which was not quite an agreement and not quite a deflection, but landed somewhere honest between the two. Then he put his hat on and walked out of the store. The schoolhouse was in worse shape than the school board's letter had suggested. Clara spent the better part of 2 days in there before the term started sweeping out a winter's worth of dust and dead leaves, organizing what remained of the previous teacher's supply closet, and making a list of everything that needed to be requisitioned, repaired, or replaced. The wood stove in the corner was functional but temperamental. 3 of the window latches were broken and let cold air in. The chalkboard was cracked down the middle, still usable but not ideal. She was up on a chair trying to secure one of the window latches with a length of wire she'd found in the supply closet when the door opened. She did not fall off the chair, which she considered a personal victory, given how startled she was. It was not Daniel Kane. It was a woman, mid-40s, well-dressed, carrying herself with the particular confidence of someone who had spent enough time being important in a small town that she'd stopped noticing she was doing it. She looked at Clara on the chair with the latch and the wire, and her expression did the thing that Clara had spent her whole life watching expressions do. The assessment, the recalibration. You're the new teacher, the woman said. It was not a question. Clara Whitfield, Clara said. She stepped down from the chair with the deliberate care of someone who had learned not to be clumsy in front of strangers. And you are? Margaret Alderton, the woman said. My husband is on the school board. I chair the ladies' auxiliary. She looked around the room. You've made progress. There was considerable room for progress, Clara said. Margaret Alderton walked the length of the room, examining things in the way of a woman accustomed to finding fault and finding it efficiently. You're younger than I expected, she said. And, a pause carefully waited, not quite what I pictured when they said Lawrence was sending a teacher. What did you picture? Clara asked. The woman turned. She had the grace to look slightly caught. Someone more established, she said. I've been teaching for 4 years, Clara said. I would consider that established for my age. Margaret Alderton held her gaze. There was a calculation happening behind those eyes, the kind that Clara recognized as a woman deciding how directly she intended to be. I'll be plain with you, Margaret said. The town knows you arrived under unfortunate circumstances. Arthur Finch's rejection was not private. No, Clara said. I gathered that. There will be people, Margaret said, who judge you for that, who think it reflects poorly on your suitability. Clara set the wire down on the desk. She looked at Margaret Alderton and kept her voice entirely level. Mrs. Alderton, she said, a man decided I wasn't what he wanted before he knew anything about me. I don't consider that a reflection on my suitability. I consider it a reflection on his character. Margaret Alderton blinked. Then, remarkably, something shifted in her expression, something that might have been respect, moving carefully through the layers of convention. You're a direct woman, she said. I am, Clara agreed. That will serve you well, Margaret said. With some. With others, it will make things harder. Most things worth doing are harder than they should be, Clara said. I've found it's best to begin as I mean to go on. There was a pause. Margaret Alderton looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, I'll bring the Mothers' Committee by Thursday to meet you, 4 o'clock. I'll have the room presentable by then, Clara said. Margaret nodded once. She walked to the door, then paused. The window latch, she said without turning around. My husband has tools. I'll send someone. She left. Clara stood in the middle of the empty schoolroom for a moment. Then she went and got back on the chair with the wire, because she had found in her experience that it was better not to wait on someone else to fix your window. 3 days before school was to begin, there was a knock at the front door of the boarding house early in the morning. Clara heard it from her room and heard Mrs. Holt's footsteps cross the front hall and the sound of the door opening. Then Mrs. Holt's voice, "Dan," and Daniel Kane's voice, "Morning, Harriet. Is Miss Whitfield available?" Clara was at the top of the stairs before she'd fully decided to go down them. Howe was standing in the front doorway, hat in hand, with a young man behind him, perhaps 16, rangy, with the look of someone who had recently had a growth spurt and not yet come to terms with his own arms and legs. The boy was holding a toolbox. "I heard your schoolhouse has a window problem," Daniel said when he saw her on the stairs. She stopped 2 steps from the bottom. "Word travels fast," she said. "Mrs. Alderton mentioned it to my foreman," he said, "who mentioned it to me." He nodded toward the boy. "This is Hector. He's got a good hand with repairs." Clara looked at Hector. Hector looked at his boots. "You didn't have to do that," she said to Daniel. "The school board should have dealt with it before you arrived," he said. "Since they didn't, someone should. It's cold in there with broken latches." "I was managing," she said. "With wire," he said, "not accusatory, just accurate." She looked at him. He looked back, steady and unhurried. The way she was coming to understand was simply how he occupied space, as though he had decided where he was going to be, and saw no particular reason to be anxious about it. "All right," she said. "I'll show you what needs doing." Hector turned out to be not just good with repairs, but excellent, methodical, and quiet, working through the list of broken latches and loose boards, and a stovepipe joint that had worked itself loose with the efficiency of someone who had grown up learning to fix things because things needed fixing, and there was no one else to do it. Daniel did not stay to work. He stayed the way a person stayed when they weren't sure whether they should leave, but weren't ready to yet. He drifted to the window while Hector worked on the latch and looked out at the empty schoolyard. "How many students?" Clara said. 14 last year," he said. "Maybe 12 this term, depending on which families have moved on." He paused. "Couple of them have had a rough time of it since Mrs. Connolly left. Ben Alderton, Margaret's youngest, took it hard. Smart kid. Got quiet after she left." "How quiet?" Clara asked. "Stop talking in class, quiet," Daniel said. "His brother's in my employ, so I hear things." Clara filed this away. "What does he care about?" Daniel glanced at her. "Horses. He's been coming out to the ranch on his brother's days off. I've been letting him help with the yearlings." "He trusts you." "Seems to." "Then when he's being difficult in school," Clara said, "I may ask you to say something to him." Daniel looked at her. "I'm not a natural authority on schooling. You're an authority he respects," she said. "That's what matters." She moved to the other window, checking the latch Hector had just fixed, running her thumb along the mechanism. Every difficult child has someone they listen to. You find that person and you have a path. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Martha Connolly used to say something like that," he said. "Did she?" Clara said. "She said every child was a problem worth solving if you were patient enough to find the right angle." "She sounds like she was a good teacher," Clara said. "She was," Daniel said. Another silence. Outside, the schoolyard was white, and still the snow undisturbed since the last fall. "Mr. Kane," Clara said without turning from the window. "Miss Whitfield. When you offered to pay for my room on Christmas night," she said, "was it because you felt sorry for me?" She heard him shift. Then, "No." "What was it then?" A pause. "I told you what it was," he said. "I know what it is to be somewhere alone when you expected different." She turned then. He was looking at her with that same steady, unhurried regard, and she searched it carefully, the way she'd learned to search people's faces for what they weren't saying, and found unexpectedly that what she saw there was exactly what he'd claimed. Not pity. Something more careful than that. The recognition of one person by another who understood a particular kind of quiet. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. Hector called from the stovepipe that he'd found another loose joint near the ceiling, and the moment, whatever it had been closed around itself, and moved on. Clara Whitfield, standing in the cold-aired schoolroom, with the pale winter light coming through the newly latched windows, allowed herself to notice carefully, and with considerable self-protective reserve, that Daniel Kane was a man worth paying attention to. She also reminded herself that she had made that kind of careful, reserved investment before in a man who had handed her dried flowers out of embarrassment and walked away. She went back to her inventory list. But she noticed. School began on a Monday. Clara was at the schoolhouse before sunrise. She had been awake since 4. Not from nerves. She told herself it wasn't nerves, but from the particular alertness of a person who had learned that preparation was the only reliable defense against a world that liked to catch you off guard. She had her lesson plan written out on 3 sheets of paper in her careful, even hand. She had the stove going by 7. She had the chalkboard wiped clean, and the chalk arranged in the tray, and the desks straightened to within an inch of their lives. At 8:15, the first child appeared in the doorway. He was small, no more than 7, with a serious face, and a wool cap pulled so far down that only his eyes and nose were visible. He looked at Clara the way a person looked at something they weren't sure about yet. "Are you the new teacher?" he said. "I am," Clara said. "I'm Miss Whitfield. What's your name?" He considered this as if deciding whether to commit. "Samuel," he said finally. "Good morning, Samuel," she said. "Come in and choose a seat." He came in. He chose the seat closest to the door. By 8:30, 11 children had arrived and arranged themselves in the configuration that Clara recognized immediately. The 2 or 3 who sat in front, the cluster in the middle, who were still deciding, and the ones in the back, who had already concluded that school was something that happened to them rather than something they participated in. Among the back row occupants was a boy of about 13 with dark eyes and a jaw set in the particular way of a child who had decided in advance not to cooperate. He had Margaret Alderton's coloring and her husband's squared shoulders. Bun Alderton. Clara looked at him, once assessed him in the same way she'd been assessed by people her entire life, quickly, accurately, without letting the assessment show on her face, and moved on. "Good morning," she said to all of them. A few of them said it back. Ben Alderton said nothing. "My name is Miss Whitfield," she said. "I came from Lawrence. I've been teaching for 4 years, which is longer than some of you have been alive." She let that settle. "I know you had a teacher you liked, and I know I'm not her. That's all right. I'm not trying to be her. I'm trying to teach you, which is a different thing." A girl in the middle row raised her hand. "Are you the lady who got left at the train station at Christmas?" The room went very quiet. Clara looked at the girl. She was perhaps 10, with a direct, curious expression that was not mean, just unfiltered in the way of children who hadn't yet learned that some information was better left unspoken. "Yes," Clara said. Another silence. Several of the children exchanged glances. "That was rude of him," the girl said. "It was," Clara agreed. "Why did he do it?" "Because he made a judgment about me before he knew me," Clara said. "That happens sometimes. It's usually a mistake." She picked up the chalk. "Speaking of mistakes, let's talk about arithmetic. I want to know what you already know so I know where we're starting." She wrote a problem on the board. Only Ben Alderton in the back row did not pick up a slate. She did not address it. Not yet. By the end of the first week, Clara had a clear picture of where each of her 12 students stood, which ones had a natural aptitude for reading, but struggled with numbers, which ones were sharp across the board, and bored by the pace, which ones had gaps that suggested they'd missed significant stretches of school for reasons that were almost certainly economic. She had adjusted her lesson plans accordingly, which meant she was up until 10 o'clock every night rewriting what she'd prepared, which meant she was tired in a way that was productive and therefore tolerable. She had also identified the specific configuration of Ben Alderton's resistance. I was not stupid. That was the first thing. The second was that he knew he wasn't stupid, which meant his refusal to engage had nothing to do with inability and everything to do with will. He sat in the back row and watched her with those dark, careful eyes, and he did the work when she made it impossible not to written exercises where she stood close enough that not picking up the slate would have been too obvious a statement even for him. But he never volunteered, never answered when she asked, never let on that he was listening even when his face told her that he was. On Friday afternoon, when the others had gone, and he was taking his time with his coat in the way of someone who was hoping to avoid conversation, she said, "Ben." He stopped. "I'm not going to ask you to like me," she said. "You don't have to like me. But I need you to be present, which means more than your body being in that chair." He looked at her with the expression of a person waiting for the part where they got in trouble. "I know you've been helping Mr. Kane with the yearlings on Saturdays," she said. That surprised him. His expression cracked open just slightly. "He told me you're good with them," she said. "That the young ones respond to you." Ben said nothing, but the set of his jaw had changed. "Animals aren't so different from numbers," Clara said. "You can't force either one. You have to figure out what they need, and then provide it, and then wait." She picked up his slate, which he'd left on the desk, and handed it to him. "I'm willing to wait, but you have to give me something to work with." He took the slate. He didn't say anything, but when he left, he didn't slam the door. She counted it. She ran into Daniel Kane on Saturday morning at the edge of town, where the road forked toward the ranch. She had been walking. She walked every morning when the weather was passable, partly for the air, and partly because it was the one time of day she had no obligations to anyone, and he was coming in from the direction of the ranch on horseback, which was how she knew it was him before she saw his face. Nobody else she had met in Caldwell had that particular way of sitting in a saddle, as though the horse was an extension of himself, rather than a mode of transportation. He slowed when he saw her and stopped. "Morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked down at her from the horse with the same unhurried attention he always brought to her, and she had noticed over the past 3 weeks that this particular kind of attention had stopped making her defensive the way it used to when strangers looked at her. With Daniel Kane, it didn't feel like assessment. It felt like she wasn't sure what it felt like. She hadn't found the right word for it yet. "How was the first week?" he said. "Productive," she said. "Your assessment of Ben Alderton was accurate. He's sharp." "He is," Daniel said. "He's also furious about something," Clara said. "Something that predates Mrs. Connolly leaving. Do you know what it is?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked down the road in the way of a man deciding what was his to share and what wasn't. "His father," he said finally. "Gerald Alderton has opinions about what his son should be. Ben doesn't match them." "What does Gerald Alderton want him to be?" "What Gerald Alderton is," Daniel said, "which is a particular kind of man with a particular kind of pride, and not a lot of patience for anything that doesn't reflect well on him." Clara absorbed this. "Ben wants to work with animals," she said. "He wants to be a veterinarian," Daniel said, "which his father considers unsuitable." The word landed between them with a weight that Clara felt personally the way she always felt the specific weight of that word when it was applied to wanting something the world had already decided wasn't for you. "Does Ben know you're letting him work with the yearlings because you think it matters?" she said. Daniel looked at her. "I'm letting him work with the yearlings because he's good at it, and I can use the help." "That's not all of it," Clara said. A pause. "No," he said. "It's not all of it." "Tell him," she said. "He needs to hear that what he wants is worth something, from someone who isn't me." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once the way he nodded when he'd decided something. "All right," he said. He would have ridden on then. She could see him gathering the reins, but she said, "Mr. Kane," and he stopped. "How long has the ranch been just you?" she said. It was a direct question, possibly too direct. She saw something move across his face, the flicker she'd seen before in the general store there and gone. 6 years, he said. She waited. He was a man who continued talking if you gave him room and didn't push. "My wife passed," he said. "In childbirth. The child too." He said it without inflection, the way a person spoke about something they had decided not to perform for other people. 6 years ago this February. The road was quiet around them. Somewhere in the distance a crow called twice and went silent. "I'm sorry," Clara said, the way she meant it. He looked at her. Then he said, "You're the first person who said that in about 5 years who didn't follow it up with a suggestion about who I should remarry." "That sounds exhausting," Clara said. Something shifted in his expression. That thing that was adjacent to a smile. "It is," he said. She looked up at him. She had to look up on horseback. He had a significant height advantage, and she said, "For what it's worth, I think 6 years of running a ranch by yourself and keeping a grieving 13-year-old boy occupied on Saturdays is not nothing." He looked at her for a moment that lasted a beat longer than conversation strictly required. "Much obliged, Miss Whitfield," he said. He rode on. Clara stood in the road for a moment, the cold air on her face, and made herself walk. The invitation came on a Tuesday, delivered by Hector, who appeared at the schoolhouse door at the end of the school day with a folded note and the expression of someone who had been told to deliver it and had decided not to have feelings about this assignment. The note read, "Miss Whitfield, there is a matter at the ranch that I would appreciate your opinion on if you have time Thursday afternoon. D. Kane." She read it twice. Then she wrote back, "Mr. Kane, I have time Thursday. C. Whitfield." She handed it to Hector, who pocketed it and left without ceremony. Mrs. Holt, who had been in the hallway and who had eyes like a hawk and the social awareness of a woman who had run a boarding house for 30 years, said nothing when Clara came in. But at dinner she passed the bread without being asked and refilled Clara's coffee without comment, which was as close to an opinion as Mrs. Holt generally came. Daniel sent the wagon for her Thursday afternoon. Hector drove it. She had been to the edge of the Kane property before passing on her morning walks, but she hadn't been down the main drive, and she understood taking it in, now that the ranch was substantially larger than she'd imagined. Not extravagant. There was nothing decorative about any of it, nothing built for show. Everything was functional and solid, and clearly maintained with the same direct, efficient attention that Daniel Kane brought to everything. The house itself was large enough to be impressive and plain enough not to be. Daniel met her at the front, hat in hand. He had the look of a man who was not accustomed to receiving visitors and was doing his best to manage the awkwardness of it without drawing attention to the awkwardness. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Of course," she said. "What was the matter?" He glanced toward the barn. "It's easier to show you than explain it," he said. In the barn, 3 yearling horses were in their stalls, 2 of them calm, 1 of them clearly not. The anxious one moved in tight circles, ears back, refusing to stand still when Daniel approached. "She's been like this for 2 weeks," Daniel said. "Skittish past what's normal. Won't let me work with her." Clara looked at the horse. "Has anything changed in the last 2 weeks?" "Nothing I can identify," he said. "Has Ben worked with her?" He looked at her. "Not recently." "That might be part of it," Clara said. "If she's bonded to a particular handler and that handler's been absent, she's going to be unsettled." She moved toward the stall, slowly, not approaching, but moving parallel to it, not making eye contact with the horse. "What does he call her?" "Penny." Clara stopped. She said quietly in the direction of the stall, but without looking directly at the animal, "Penny." Just the name. Nothing else. The horse's ear rotated toward her. She said it again. "Penny." And then she was quiet, and she stood still, and she waited. Daniel said nothing. He understood she thought the value of not filling silence unnecessarily. After perhaps 2 minutes, the horse stopped circling. "You've done this before," Daniel said. "I grew up on a farm," Clara said. "Not this kind, but my father had draft horses. I learned young that the fastest way to lose an animal's trust is to need it too quickly." She could feel Daniel looking at her in that particular way of his. She did not turn around. "Bun should come back," she said. "Whatever happened with his schedule, get him back out here this Saturday." "I'll make sure of it," Daniel said. She finally turned from the stall. Daniel was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not the steady assessment she'd grown accustomed to, but something more open, more careful, as though he'd arrived at a thought he hadn't expected. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Then honestly, I was thinking that you pay attention to things differently than most people." "How do most people pay attention?" "They look at what's in front of them," he said. "You look at what's causing it." Clara held his gaze. "That's just teaching," she said. "You spend 4 years figuring out why children do what they do. You get in the habit of looking for the source." "Maybe," he said. But he didn't look convinced that that was all of it. They walked back out toward the house. Hector had disappeared somewhere useful, which was characteristic of him. The afternoon light was coming in low and flat, the kind of winter light that made everything look simultaneously colder and more vivid. "I'll start coffee," Daniel said. It was not a question exactly, but she said, "All right," and followed him in. The kitchen was the most lived-in room in the house. That was the first thing she noticed, that a man who clearly used very little of the house still used the kitchen, and used it in a way that suggested habit and a certain amount of comfort. The table was worn smooth at the edges. There was a coffee pot that had been used approximately 10,000 times. A cast-iron pan hung on the wall that was seasoned to perfection. Clara, who had been cooking since she was 8 years old, noticed all of this, the way she noticed everything, quickly cataloging it without drawing attention to the cataloging. She also noticed that there was almost nothing in the pantry. Not nothing, but close. A man feeding himself and himself, only not bothering with anything that required more than minimal effort, because minimal effort was all the situation required. She said, without thinking about whether to say it, "You're not eating properly." Daniel looked up from the coffee pot. He had an expression of a man who had not expected that sentence. "I eat fine," he said. "You have salt pork, dried beans, and a heel of bread," Clara said. "That's what a man eats when he's not paying attention to eating, not fine." A pause. "You learned that from the draft horses, too." "I learned that from being a woman who has cooked for a living since I was a teenager," Clara said. "May I?" He looked at her. "May you what?" She had already moved to the pantry, was already doing a more thorough inventory. "Cook something," she said. "I'm going to be here another hour at least, and if there's coffee, there should be food. And I notice you have flour and lard, and some dried herbs that haven't completely lost their character." "Miss Whitfield, you can say no," she said, turning to look at him directly. "I'm not presuming. I'm offering. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right." "All right," to which, "All right, I'd appreciate it," he said, which was a longer sentence in the direction of vulnerability than she suspected he usually managed. She made biscuits. It was the most sensible thing to make with what was available, fast-filling and forgiving of imprecision. She worked efficiently without ceremony, in the way of someone for whom cooking was not an art form, but a language, a practical means of expressing something that didn't always have other words. Daniel sat at the table and drank his coffee and watched her. He had the look of a man who was not sure what to do with this situation, but had decided to allow it. "Tell me about your wife," Clara said. She heard him go still. "I'm sorry," she said, not stopping her work. "That's intrusive. You don't have to." "No," he said slowly. I don't mind." A pause. "Her name was Alice. She was from Missouri, came out here with her family when she was 16. We married when she was 20. He was quiet for a moment. "She hated the winters. She never complained about them, but I could tell. Come February, she'd get this look like she was counting the days till the light changed." Clara kept her hands moving. "Did she love the ranch?" "She loved what we were making of it," he said. She was good at seeing what things could become. I tend to see what's in front of me." "You see more than that," Clara said. "Not the way Alice did," he said. "She could walk into a room and tell you what it would look like in 10 years. I walk into a room and tell you what needs fixing." "Both are useful," Clara said. "Yes," he said. "But only one of them is the kind of thing that makes a house feel like something's possible." The biscuits went into the oven. Clara washed her hands at the basin, dried them on the cloth hanging from the hook, and turned around. Daniel was looking at his coffee cup. "She sounds like she was extraordinary," Clara said. "She was ordinary," he said. "That's what I miss most. She was just ordinary. Everyday ordinary." He looked up. "You know what I mean." She did. She thought about the particular unbearable weight of not having ordinary the way it sat on a person, the way she had spent her whole life, knowing she was supposed to be building something ordinary and finding repeatedly that the ordinary was not available to her. "Yes," she said. "I know what you mean." They looked at each other across the kitchen. Something passed between them, not romantic or not only that, but the more fundamental recognition of two people who understood a specific kind of loss and were not going to pretend they didn't. It was Daniel who looked away first, but not because he was retreating. More the way a person looked away from something bright. The biscuits were ready in 20 minutes. They ate them at the kitchen table with the coffee and the last of a jar of preserves that Clara found on the second shelf. Daniel ate 3 biscuits without apparent awareness that he was eating 3 biscuits, which confirmed her initial assessment about the eating situation. "The school board meeting is next week," he said. "Margaret Alderton will give a report on the first month." "I know," Clara said. "She came by the schoolhouse on Wednesday." He looked up. "How did it go?" "She asked pointed questions, and I gave her direct answers," Clara said. "We understand each other." "She can make your life difficult," he said, "if she decides to." "Most people can make life difficult," Clara said. "It doesn't mean they will." She picked up her coffee cup. "She's not a cruel woman. She's a careful one. There's a difference." "You're more generous to her than most people are," he said. "I'm accurate," Clara said. "I find it's more useful." He looked at her with that expression again, the one that had started appearing more frequently, the one where he seemed to be revising something he'd previously concluded. She had gotten accustomed to it. She wasn't sure she minded it. "Your father," he said. "The draft horses. He's still farming." "He passed when I was 19, she said. "My mother 2 years later. I was already teaching by then. I sent money home while she was alive." "Brothers, sisters?" "2 brothers older," she said. "Both married, both settled. Neither of them particularly interested in an unmarried younger sister with opinions." She said it without bitterness. Just fact. "I've managed well enough on my own." "I can see that," he said. A pause. The house was quiet around them, the specific quiet of a place that had grown used to containing one person and was now aware in the way spaces became aware of a second. "This is a large house for one person," Clara said. "It was built for more," he said. "Simple, not self-pitying, just true." She looked at him. I was looking at the table, his coffee cup in his hand, and she could see in his face, not grief, not exactly, but the settled permanent kind of loss that had been there so long it had become part of his posture, the way certain injuries healed into the body and became part of how a person moved. She said, "I've been offered a room." He looked up. "Mrs. Holt's niece is arriving from St. Louis in February," Clara said. "She'll need the room. I'll need to find other accommodations before then." It was true. Mrs. Holt had mentioned it 3 days ago, apologetically, and with genuine regret. Daniel held her gaze. She could see him thinking not the way most men thought, which was forward-building toward what they wanted to say. He thought the way she did back first, checking what was true, before he decided what to do about it. "There are 3 rooms in this house that aren't being used," he said. "I know," she said. "I also know what the town would say about that." "The town already said a considerable amount about you when you arrived," he said. "They seem to manage without running out of opinions." "It would be different," Clara said. "What they said when I arrived was that I was unfortunate. What they'd say then would be something worse." He was quiet. "I'm not saying no," she said carefully. "I'm saying I want us both to understand what we'd be agreeing to, the cost of it, so neither of us is surprised later." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the most careful person I've ever met," he said. "I've had to be," she said. "Yes," he said. "I reckon you have." She was on her way out. Coat on carpetbag she'd brought with her for the teaching materials, Hector waiting with the wagon when Daniel came to the door behind her. "Miss Whitfield." She turned. He stood in the doorway of the house and he said, "The rooms are here if you need them. The offer stands. You make the decision in your own time, and I'll abide by whatever it is." She looked at him. "And you understand what people will say." "I've been in this town for 15 years, he said. "I understand what people say. I've generally found it matters considerably less than what's actually true." She looked at him for another moment. Then she said, "I'll let you know by the end of the week." She turned and walked toward the wagon. She did not let herself turn around again, but she heard him behind her say quietly, not to her, not meant to carry, just said, "Fair enough." And she thought about the kitchen with the worn table and the coffee pot used 10,000 times, and the 3 empty rooms, and a man who had spent 6 years in a house built for more. And she thought about the particular kind of ordinary that she had been told in ways direct and indirect for most of her life was not available to a woman who looked the way she looked. And she thought maybe, just maybe. She climbed into the wagon. Hector clicked his tongue at the horse, and they rolled forward down the drive. The house grew smaller behind her. She did not look back, but she was already thinking about what she would say at the end of the week. On Friday morning, Margaret Alderton appeared at the schoolhouse before classes began. Clara was at the chalkboard. She heard the door and turned. Margaret looked not precisely worried, but braced the way a woman looked when she was carrying information she hadn't decided what to do with yet. "There's talk," Margaret said. Clara set down the chalk. "What kind?" "The kind that starts when a woman visits a widowed man's ranch alone and comes back after dark," Margaret said. "It was 6 in the evening," Clara said. "In January, 6 in the evening is after dark," Margaret said. "You know that." Clara looked at her. She was not angry, not yet. She was taking stock. "What is the substance of the talk?" "That you're positioning yourself," Margaret said. "That you saw an opportunity in Daniel Kane and you're pursuing it strategically." The word hung there. Clara let it hang for a moment. "And what do you think?" she said. Margaret looked at her directly, the honest, straight-on look of a woman who had decided to be square. "I think you're a practical woman who needed accommodations and who has made a useful connection," she said. "I also think the town won't see it's that way, and that Daniel Kane's reputation is it matters in this community. He's done a great deal for people here." "I know that," Clara said. "Then you'll understand," Margaret said carefully, "that if you move into that house, there are people who will make it their business to make both your lives very difficult." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mrs. Alderton, may I ask you something directly?" "You may." "Do you believe I have honorable intentions toward Daniel Kane?" Margaret held her gaze for a beat. Then, "I believe you are an honorable woman, yes." "Then I would appreciate it," Clara said, "if you would be willing to say so when the time comes." Margaret blinked. She had not expected that. Clara could see her processing at the shift from delivering a warning to being recruited as an ally and the particular experience of realizing that the woman she'd come to caution had already thought 3 steps ahead. "You're not going to make the cautious choice," Margaret said. It wasn't quite a question. "I haven't decided yet," Clara said. "But when I do decide, I'll make the honest choice. Those are usually the same thing." Margaret looked at her for another long moment. Then she said, "My Ben came home from school on Wednesday talking about prime factorization." Clara waited. "He hasn't come home talking about school in 4 months," Margaret said. Clara said nothing. "He set the table without being asked," Margaret said. "First time this year." She straightened her coat, the small collected gesture of a woman reassembling her composure. "I'll say what I believe when the time comes," she said. "That's what I can offer." "That's everything," Clara said. Margaret nodded once, turned and left. Clara stood in the empty schoolroom and let out a long, slow breath. The children would arrive in 20 minutes. She had a full day ahead of her and a decision to make by the end of the week, and a town that was already watching her with the particular attentiveness of people who believed they knew what they were seeing. She picked up the chalk and turned back to the board. She was here. She had come this far. She had 31 cents and dried flowers, and a man's quiet, steady voice saying the offer stands, and she was not. She was absolutely not going to let other people's expectations determine the shape of her life. Not again. Not this time. She moved into the ranch on a Saturday. She had told Daniel on Thursday evening in a note delivered by Hector, which was the communication system they had apparently settled into without discussing it. The note said, "Mr. Kane, I've made my decision. I'll take the room. Saturday morning if that suits. C. Whitfield. His reply came back within the hour. Saturday suits fine. D. Kane. Mrs. Holt helped her pack. She didn't say much that was not Mrs. Holt's way, but she folded Clara's second dress with the particular care of a woman who was saying something with her hands that she hadn't decided to say with her mouth. When she was done, she pressed Clara's hand once firmly between both of hers. "You're a sensible woman," Mrs. Holt said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "I won't," Clara said. "And if Daniel Kane gives you any trouble—" "He won't," Clara said. Mrs. Holt looked at her for a moment, reading her face the way she read everything with the thoroughness of long practice. Then she nodded, satisfied by what she found. "No," she agreed. "He won't." Hector came for her at 9. She carried her own carpetbag to the wagon because she had carried it this far and saw no reason to stop now. She did not look at the people on the street, though she was aware of them. A woman in front of the millinery, 2 men outside the hardware store, a cluster of 3 near the post office who stopped talking when they saw her climb into the wagon. She kept her chin level. She was good at that. The ranch received her the way it had the first time, quietly, without ceremony. Daniel met her at the door, took her carpetbag without asking, and showed her to the room at the end of the east hallway. It was clean. There was a quilt on the bed that had the look of something made with intention, the kind of stitching that took time. There was a hook on the wall for her coat, a washstand, a window that looked toward the barn. "It was Alice's sewing room," he said. Then, as if realizing how that sounded, "I cleared it out last year. It needed to be something useful." "It's a good room," Clara said. "There's a latch on the door," he said, "from the inside." She looked at him. He held her gaze steadily the way he always did, without apology, but without presumption either. He was telling her something specific about the terms of this arrangement, and they both knew it. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. "Breakfast is at 6. Dinner's at 7 if I'm in from the range. If I'm not, there's generally something in the larder." He paused. "You don't have to cook." "I know I don't have to," Clara said. "But I'm going to, so you may as well factor it in." Something moved across his face, that thing adjacent to a smile. "All right," he said, and left her to settle. She set the carpetbag on the bed, hung her coat on the hook, and placed the dried wildflowers on the washstand beside the basin. She stood there for a moment and looked at them. The flowers Arthur Finch had handed her out of pity on Christmas night, soft and faded now, but still holding their shape. She had kept them. She realized, not because she was sentimental about him, but because she was sentimental about the moment. The moment of deciding in a coal depot with 31 cents in her pocket that she was not going to let one man's cowardice determine the rest of her life. She straightened them in the glass and went to start dinner. Talk began within the week. She heard the first of it from Samuel, her youngest student, 7 years old, the one who had chosen the desk closest to the door on the first day. He was not a malicious child. He simply had the particular quality of small children raised around adults who talked without worrying about what small children could hear. "My mama says you're living at Mr. Kane's ranch," he said at the end of the school day, with the conversational blandness of someone reporting the weather. "I am," Clara said. He thought about this. "She says that's peculiar." "Does she?" Clara said. "I said I didn't think so," Samuel said. "Because you're the teacher, and teachers have to live somewhere." "That is correct reasoning," Clara said. He beamed at her with the pure, uncomplicated satisfaction of a child who had applied logic successfully and went home. Clara locked the schoolhouse and walked back to the ranch. The peculiar, as Samuel's mother called it, grew. By the second week, it had acquired shape and direction, the kind of talk that moved through a small town, the way water moved through cracked ground, finding every gap. She heard pieces of it from Hector, who reported things without editorializing, in the blunt, factual way of a young man who had decided she was trustworthy and acted accordingly. She heard pieces of it from Margaret Alderton, who came to the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon, wearing an expression that was both apologetic and braced. "Gerald's talking," Margaret said. "Your husband," Clara said. "He's on the school board," Margaret said. "He's been asking questions about the appropriateness of a single female teacher residing in the home of an unmarried man." Clara kept her voice level. What kind of questions? The kind that aren't really questions, Margaret said. The kind that are conclusions dressed up as questions. What does he conclude? Margaret looked at her directly. That your presence in Daniel's house is inappropriate, that it reflects poorly on the school, and that the board has grounds to reconsider your appointment. The room went very still. Not around Clara. Clara was still. It was the particular stillness of a person absorbing a blow without showing the absorption, processing the full weight of it quietly behind steady eyes. On what grounds specifically? She said. Conduct unbecoming, Margaret said. It's vague enough to apply to nearly anything. It's vague enough to apply to a woman who makes a man uncomfortable, Clara said. Yes, Margaret said. That's generally how it's used. Clara stood up. She walked to the window, not to look at anything, just to have the movement to give her hands somewhere to be. Do you agree with him? She said. No, Margaret said without hesitation. But I'm not on the school board. Is there anyone on the board who would push back? Possibly, Margaret said. But Gerald can be persuasive when he's decided on something. And right now he's decided. She paused. Clara. It was the first time Margaret had used her given name. Clara turned from the window. He's not just after your position, Margaret said quietly. He's after Daniel. They've had a history. Property dispute 2 years back. Gerald lost. He hasn't forgotten. The shape of the thing changed. Clara looked at Margaret and felt the specific dangerous clarity of understanding not just what was happening to her, but why and in whose service. This isn't about me, Clara said. It's about you and him both, Margaret said. You're the lever. Daniel is the target. She told Daniel that evening. She didn't soften it. She didn't approach it carefully or arrange it for easier landing. She came in from the schoolhouse, set her coat on the hook and said, Gerald Alderton is going to use my position here to come after your reputation. I want you to know that before it happens. Daniel looked up from the table where he'd been going over papers. He was still for a moment. Then he said, How long have you known? About the property dispute since this afternoon, she said. About the fact that this was coming since the day I moved in. He set down the paper. You moved in anyway. I made a decision I believed was honest, she said. I knew there'd be a cost. I wanted to make sure you knew the cost too. He looked at her with that particular look, the one that had started appearing more frequently, the one where she could see something shifting in him, some recalibration happening behind his eyes. You're telling me this so I can ask you to leave, he said. I'm telling you this so you can make an informed choice, she said. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, What does Alderton think he's going to do? Challenge my appointment, she said. On grounds of inappropriate conduct. There's been no inappropriate conduct, Daniel said. The directness of it, the simple unqualified flatness of the statement, was something she'd expected and still found unexpectedly stabilizing. I know that, she said. You know that. The question is whether the school board will care about the distinction. Daniel stood up. He had that quality he had when he was arriving at a decision. Something gathered in him, focused the way a man looked when he had run the numbers and knew what they added up to. I'll go see Jim Hartwell tomorrow, he said. He's on the board. He's a reasonable man. Margaret says Gerald can be persuasive. Gerald can be loud, Daniel said. That's not the same thing. He looked at her. I'm not going to ask you to leave, Miss Whitfield. Clara, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it. He stopped. She hadn't used her given name with him before, not offered it, not asked for the shift. She watched him take it in. Clara, he said, just said it, like he was checking its weight. If you're going to go to the school board on my account, she said, I'd prefer we be past surnames. All right, he said. Then I'm Daniel. He held her gaze. And I'm not going to ask you to leave. She nodded once. She was not going to make a moment out of this. It wasn't the time, and she was too careful a person to let emotion run ahead of circumstance. But she let herself privately feel the specific rare relief of a man saying, I'm not sending you away, and meaning it without condition. Good, she said. I'll start dinner. The school board meeting was the following Tuesday. Clara was not invited. That was not how school board meetings worked. The teacher was not present while her employment was discussed, which had always struck her as a particularly tidy piece of absurdity, the person most affected being the person with the least voice in the matter. She taught her classes, walked home to the ranch, and waited. Daniel came home late. She heard the wagon at 9 o'clock, heard him in the barn, heard his boots on the porch steps. She was at the kitchen table with a lamp and the month's lesson plans spread out in front of her, which was true and also was something to do with her hands, which was the more accurate reason. He came in, hung his hat, sat down across from her. She waited. It was close, he said. 4-3. 4-3 which way? She said. In your favor, he said. Jim Hartwell and 2 others. She let out a breath through her nose, slow and controlled. And Gerald told me afterward that this wasn't finished, Daniel said. That he had concerns about the moral character of the school. Did he say that to you directly? He said it loudly in the general vicinity of anyone who was listening, Daniel said, which was more effective from his perspective. Clara was quiet for a moment. He's going to keep going, she said. Yes, Daniel said. Until he has enough people behind him to make it stick, she said. That's his way, Daniel said. He's patient when he's decided on something. He looked at her steadily. So am I. She looked at him. What does that mean for you? It means I'm not going to be run out of my own house or my own town by Gerald Alderton's version of the facts, he said. And I'm not going to let you be either. She held his gaze. The lamp between them made the room feel closer than it was warmer, and she was aware of him in the specific, inconvenient way she'd been increasingly aware of him over the past weeks. Not just as a man she respected, but as a person whose presence had stopped being an arrangement and started being something she looked for at the end of the day. She was careful with that. She had been careful with it, but she was aware. Daniel, she said. Clara, what does Gerald Alderton's version of the facts say about you? About what you want from this arrangement? He held her gaze without flinching. It says I'm a lonely widower who saw a woman in a vulnerable position and took advantage of it, he said. Which is precisely backwards and precisely the kind of story that travels well because it's simple. And what's the true version? She said. I was quiet for a moment. Not evasive, she'd learned the difference with him. Just honest about the fact that he was choosing words for accuracy rather than convenience. The true version, he said, is that a woman sat on a platform in the snow on Christmas night and divided a biscuit with a child who didn't have much when she didn't have much either. And I've been paying attention ever since. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at Daniel Kane across the lamp-lit table, and she felt something she had been carefully deliberately not feeling for several weeks begin to move in her in a way she couldn't entirely redirect. That's a kind thing to say, she said. It's not kind, he said. It's accurate. She looked down at the lesson plans, then back up at him. I'm going to keep teaching, she said. Whatever Gerald Alderton does, I want you to know I'm not going to run. I know you're not, he said. I never thought you would. She gathered the lesson plans together, set the stack straight, and stood up. Get some sleep, she said. You were out most of the day. So were you, he said. I'm used to it, she said. She picked up the lamp and went to her room. She was aware behind her of him still sitting at the table, the way a person sat when they had more to say, and had decided this wasn't the night for it. Not because she needed to, but because the gesture of it was honest, and she believed in honest gestures. Then she sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and let herself feel carefully and completely how much she wanted this life to be real. Gerald Alderton moved faster than they'd expected. By Thursday, there was a letter. Clara found it on the schoolhouse steps. When she arrived in the morning, no envelope, just a folded piece of paper with her name on the outside. She stood on the steps and read it, the cold morning air on her face, the children not yet arrived. It was not signed. It did not need to be. The handwriting was the penmanship of a man who had received an education and wanted you to know it, large, controlled, emphatic. A woman of your background and circumstance ought to consider what she owes to the children of this community. Their moral education cannot be entrusted to a person whose own conduct is a subject of public concern. I would encourage you to reflect carefully on whether your continued presence serves the good of Caldwell's children or only your own interests. The community is watching. She read it twice. Then she folded it, put it in her coat pocket, and went inside to start the fire. Bun Alderton came in with the others. He sat in his usual seat, not the back row anymore she'd noticed not for the past 2 weeks. He'd migrated 3 rows forward without comment, and neither had she. He had his slate, his chalk, and the beginning of an expression that suggested he might eventually in his own time become a person who participated voluntarily. She taught the morning's lessons. She was precise, and she was present, and she did not think about the letter in her pocket. At noon she sent the children outside for their break, and she sat at her desk and thought about the letter very hard for approximately 4 minutes. Then she took it out, looked at it one more time, and made a decision. She would not be frightened into leaving, but she would not be naive either. Gerald Alderton had the ear of 3 school board members, the confidence of a man who expected to win, and most importantly, a legitimate lever, which was the genuine fact that a woman living unchaperoned in a man's house was considered by enough people in Caldwell to be a matter of concern. She needed to remove the lever. She was thinking through exactly how to do this when the schoolhouse door opened and Ben Alderton came back in from his break 20 minutes early. He stood inside the door with the look of someone who had come in because outside had become untenable. "Ben," she said. He said, "They're saying you're going to leave." "Who is?" "The boys outside," he said. Tom Greer's older brother told him. "That my father—" He stopped. He had the expression of a boy who was furious and ashamed about what he was furious about in equal measure. "That my father is making sure you get dismissed." Clara looked at him steadily. "Is that what you want? For me to leave?" He looked at the floor, then up at her, and his face did something complicated. "No," he said. "Why not?" she said. "Because you're a real teacher," he said. The way he said it was not a compliment so much as a statement of fact, delivered with the particular conviction of a child who had thought it through and arrived there on his own. "You actually teach. You don't just stand there and recite things." "What's the difference?" she said. "You see what we're not understanding," he said. "You fix it." He paused. "Mrs. Connolly was good, but she taught the lesson. You teach us." Clara looked at Ben Alderton. Gerald Alderton's furious, sharp horse-loving, quietly brilliant son, and felt the particular kind of gratitude that came not from being praised, but from being accurately seen. "Your father is doing what he believes is right," she said. Ben's jaw set. "He's doing what he always does," he said. "Going after someone until they give up, so he can say he was right." "Has he ever been stopped?" Clara said. A pause. "Mr. Kane stopped him once," Ben said. 2 years ago, over the East pasture land." He looked at her. "My father hasn't forgotten." "I know," Clara said. "You knew already," Ben said, realizing. "Yes," she said. "Which means you should know that what's happening is partly about me and partly about something older than me. It isn't your fault and you don't have to carry it." Bun looked at her. 14 years old, with his mother's coloring and his father's stubborn jaw and something behind his eyes that was entirely his own. A kind of clear-eyed steadiness that Clara thought was going to serve him very well in about 10 years. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. She almost said no. Then she thought about it. Actually thought about it the way she thought about problems in the classroom, looking for the right angle. "Yes," she said. "Go back outside, and when the others talk about me leaving you, say Miss Whitfield is a good teacher and she's staying. You say it plainly without argument. And then you don't talk about it anymore." He looked at her. "That's it." "That's it," she said. "The most effective thing you can do in a conversation that's meant to make you feel small is to refuse to feel small. Say the thing that's true, say it once, and don't justify it." Bun considered this with the seriousness he brought to things he actually cared about. Then he said, "Okay." He went back outside. Clara returned to the problem. She went to see Jim Hartwell herself. She knew it was irregular. She knew the proper response was to let Daniel handle the board relationships to operate through the established channels and the people who operated in them naturally. She knew this, and she went anyway, because she was a woman who had spent 24 years waiting for other people to fix things that affected her directly, and had found the results inconsistent. Jim Hartwell ran the feed store on the south end of town. He was a quiet, steady man of about 50, the kind of person who seemed to take up exactly as much space as necessary, and no more. He looked up when she came in, and didn't look surprised, which she took as a good sign. "Miss Whitfield," he said. "Mr. Hartwell," she said. "I'd like to talk to you about the school board meeting." "I figured you would," he said. She told him what she knew. The letter, Gerald's history with Daniel, the specific way the complaint had been constructed to be about conduct while being about something else entirely. She was direct, and she was brief, and she did not ask for sympathy. She asked for one specific thing. "If Gerald calls another meeting," she said, "I want the opportunity to speak, not to defend myself. I don't believe my conduct requires defense, but to address the actual concern, which is the living arrangement, and offer a resolution." "What resolution?" Hartwell said. "One that removes his leverage without requiring me to leave the ranch," she said. "I need a few days to arrange it, but I want to know that the board will hear me before they vote if it comes to that." Hartwell looked at her for a long moment. He had the same quality Daniel had, that careful back-first way of thinking, checking what was true before deciding what to do with it. "You've got support on the board," he said. "You know that." "I know it was 4-3, she said. "I also know that's one vote from going the other way." "Yes," he said. "It is." He paused. "What are you planning, Miss Whitfield?" "I'd rather show you than tell you," she said. "Give me 4 days." He studied her. Then he said, "All right, 4 days." She thanked him, left the feed store, and walked directly to the ranch. Daniel was in the barn when she came in. He looked up. "I went to see Jim Hartwell," she said. He set down what he was holding. He looked at her with that expression, not quite surprised, more the look of a man recalibrating an already high estimate. "Did you?" "I asked him to give me 4 days before any further board action," she said. He agreed. "4 days to do what?" Daniel said. She looked at him steadily. "To legitimize the arrangement." A silence. He understood her. She could see that he understood her, but he was working through the full dimensions of what she was saying, and she let him. "Clara," he said. "I'm not asking for anything," she said immediately. "I want to be very clear about that. What I'm proposing is a practical solution to a problem that Gerald Alderton has manufactured out of a circumstance that should have been nobody's business. I'm not asking you for anything personal." "Then what are you asking?" he said. "I'm asking if you'd be willing to speak to Reverend Miles," she said. "Not necessarily to—" She stopped, organized her thoughts. "There are different ways to legitimize a living arrangement. Some of them are permanent. Some of them are a statement of intent. I'm asking if you'd be willing to make a statement of intent publicly that removes the grounds for a conduct complaint." Howe was very still, the way he got still when he was taking something seriously. "That's a significant thing," he said. "I know it is," she said. "And I want to be honest with you because I've tried to be honest with you about everything. The reason I'm proposing this practically and not personally is because I don't know what you want. And I don't think it's fair to put that question on you in this circumstance with this pressure. I think you should want what you want, without Gerald Alderton's interference being the reason." Daniel looked at her. He held her gaze for a long moment, and she held his, and the barn was quiet and cold, and smelled like hay and horses. And she meant everything she'd said, and was also aware with the precise, uncomfortable clarity of a careful person who had finally stopped being quite careful enough that she wanted him to say something beyond the practical. That she was hoping for it. That she had been hoping for it for some time. "Clara," he said. His voice was quieter than usual. "Can I ask you something that isn't about Gerald Alderton?" She waited. "When you came here Christmas night," he said, "not to the ranch, to Caldwell, when you stepped off that train, before Finch walked away, He paused. What were you hoping for? The question caught her somewhere beneath her sternum. She looked at him. What do you mean? You said you knew it was possible that a man who'd never seen you might not be prepared, he said. He was choosing words with the same care he brought to everything slowly with precision. But you came anyway. 6 letters and 3 months and a train ticket. You came anyway. What were you hoping for? She was quiet for a moment. She had not been asked this, not in this way, not by anyone who was asking because they actually wanted to know. I was hoping, she said, for a man who looked at me and thought I was worth knowing better. She paused. Not despite how I look, not in spite of it. Just someone who looked at the whole of me and thought it was worth the time. Daniel looked at her across the barn. He said, I think it's worth considerably more than the time. She looked at him. Something opened in her chest that she had been keeping very carefully closed. Daniel, she said. I'm going to go see Reverend Miles, he said, not to solve a practical problem. He held her gaze. I want you to understand the difference. She understood the difference. She had spent her whole life understanding the difference between a man who did something for convenience and a man who did something because he had decided to. I understand, she said. He nodded once the way he nodded when he'd decided something. Then Gerald Alderton's wagon pulled into the drive. They both heard it at the same moment. Daniel's expression didn't change exactly, but something sharpened in it, went from open to present, from feeling to ready. Stay here, he said. I will not, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. He seemed to conclude rapidly and accurately that this was not a battle worth picking. They walked out of the barn together. Gerald Alderton was a big man, not tall like Daniel, but broad, with the confidence of someone who had been the largest presence in most rooms for most of his life. He was already down from the wagon when they came out, and he looked at the two of them coming out of the barn together, and the expression on his face confirmed everything Clara had already understood about him. Dan, he said. He didn't look at Clara. Gerald, Daniel said. I came to talk, Gerald said. Privately. Then you should have sent a note, Daniel said. I'd have told you there wasn't going to be anything private about it. Say what you came to say. Gerald finally looked at Clara. It was a specific kind of look, the kind that catalogued and dismissed simultaneously, that acknowledged her physical presence while treating her as something other than a person in the conversation. The town is talking, he said, to Daniel, as if Clara were not standing 3 feet away. The town talks, Daniel said. It's what towns do. About this woman living in your house, Gerald said. About what that means. About the example it sets for the children she teaches. The example it sets, Daniel said, is that a woman in a difficult circumstance was offered a decent place to live by a neighbor who had the room. That's the example. That's not what people are saying, Gerald said. What people are saying and what's true are 2 different things, Daniel said. You know that better than most, Gerald, given the last time we were in a dispute and you told the town I'd taken your water rights by fraud. Gerald's face went tight. That was a legal matter. This isn't a legal matter, Daniel said. This is you finding a new angle. Gerald looked at Clara, directly now for the first time. You should know, he said, that a woman in your position, a woman who arrived here the way you did, under the circumstances you did, does not have a great deal of standing to call on when a community decides it has concerns. Clara looked at him. She was entirely still. She had had 24 years of people informing her of the limits of her standing, and she had found over that time that the most effective response was not anger and not submission, but the particular quality of absolute present, unintimidated calm. Mr. Alderton, she said, your son is one of the finest students I've taught in 4 years of teaching. He is intelligent, observant, and capable of extraordinary things if someone takes the time to see it. She paused. I see it. I wonder whether you do. Gerald Alderton stared at her. She could see him deciding whether this was a deflection or a threat or something else entirely, and arriving, she thought, at the correct conclusion that it was none of those things. It was just the truth delivered without apology from a woman who had decided she was not going to let this man speak to her as if she weren't in the room. The silence stretched for 4 long seconds. Then Daniel said quietly and with great finality, "You should go, Gerald." Gerald looked at Daniel, then at Clara. Then he turned, climbed back onto the wagon, and drove away. Clara watched him go. She stood very still until the wagon turned out of the drive and the sound of it faded down the road. Then she said, "He'll come back." "Yes," Daniel said. "Worse next time." "Probably," Daniel said. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with that look, the open one, the one she'd seen in the barn that still hadn't fully closed. "Still going to see Reverend Miles," she said. "Tomorrow morning," he said, without hesitation. She nodded once. She was going to say something practical, something about dinner, about the time, about the lesson plans she still had to finish. She had the sentence ready. Instead, what she said was, "Thank you for not asking me to stay back." He looked at her. "I knew better," he said, "and for the first time since Christmas night, since the dried flowers, and the 31 cents, and the long cold platform." Clara Whitfield let herself smile at a man without calculating the risk first. He almost smiled back. Daniel went to see Reverend Miles on Tuesday morning. He didn't tell Clara he was going until he was already at the door with his hat in his hand, which she understood was not evasion, but the particular way of a man who made decisions completely before he announced them, who didn't present a thing until he was certain he was going to do it, because presenting it meant committing to it, and he didn't commit to things halfway. "I'll be back by noon," he said. "All right," she said. He looked at her for a moment. There was something in his face she hadn't seen before, not quite nervousness, but the careful, collected expression of a man who was doing something that mattered, and knew it mattered, and was not going to let it show how much. "Clara," he said. "Daniel," she said. A beat. Then, "Is there anything you want me to say to Miles? Anything specific?" She looked at him. She understood what he was asking, whether she had conditions, requirements, a particular form she needed this to take to feel real. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. "Tell him the truth," she said. "Whatever the truth is. That's the only thing I want said." He nodded once, put his hat on, left. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the wagon pull away, and did not let herself think too far ahead, because she was a woman who had learned the specific danger of building a life in her imagination before the facts were established. She made breakfast instead. She was very thorough about it. Reverend Miles was a small, precise man who had been in Caldwell for 11 years and had in that time developed the particular wisdom of a person who ministered to a community, small enough that he knew every secret and large enough that he'd learned not to repeat them. He received Daniel in his study, poured coffee without asking, and waited. Daniel told him plainly. He had a woman living in his house. She was the school teacher. She had come to Caldwell under difficult circumstances. She had conducted herself with complete honesty and integrity, and Gerald Alderton was using the arrangement to come after both of them, for reasons that had more to do with an old land dispute than with anyone's actual moral welfare. "I know about the land dispute," Reverend Miles said. "I expected you did," Daniel said. "And what is it you're asking me for, Daniel?" Daniel held his coffee cup in both hands and looked at the Reverend with the directness he brought to everything. "I want to make my intentions public," he said, "in a way that is honest and that removes the grounds for any further complaint about Clara's presence in my house." Reverend Miles looked at him for a moment. "Are your intentions what I think they are?" "That depends on what you think they are," Daniel said. "I think," Reverend Miles said carefully, "that you are a man who has been alone for 6 years and that you have found perhaps unexpectedly a woman whose quality you recognize, and I think you would like to say so in a way that is formal and public and irrevocable." Daniel set down his coffee. "Yes," he said. "Have you told her this?" "I've told her I'm coming to see you," Daniel said. "She told me to say whatever's true." Reverend Miles was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Daniel, I've known you a long time, since before Alice. You are not a man who does things carelessly, and you are not a man who mistakes convenience for feeling. So I'm going to trust that you know the difference between wanting to solve a problem and wanting to build a life." "I know the difference," Daniel said. "Does she?" Daniel thought about Clara on Christmas night, dividing a biscuit with a child she'd never met. Clara in the barn, talking to a frightened horse in a voice like still water. Clara at the kitchen table with the lesson plans, telling him to get some sleep, and the particular way she said it, not like a woman performing care, but like a woman who actually gave it and had learned not to make a ceremony of the giving. "She's the most careful person I've ever met," Daniel said. "She doesn't mistake anything." Reverend Miles nodded slowly. "Then come Sunday," he said. "Come both of you." She said yes before he finished asking. He came back at noon exactly as he'd said, and she was at the table with her lesson plans, and she looked up and read his face, the same way she read everything quickly and accurately, and she understood before he said a word that it had gone the way he'd intended. He sat down across from her. He didn't reach for her hands or lean forward, or make a gesture of the kind that men sometimes made when they were trying to communicate something important through performance rather than language. He just sat and looked at her and said, "Reverend Miles would like us there Sunday, if you want to come." "If I want to," she said. "You told me to say whatever's true," he said. "I did. What comes next is your decision." She looked at him. "Daniel, what exactly did you tell him was true?" He held her gaze. "That I intend to marry you," he said, "if you'll have me." The kitchen was very quiet. She had spent the morning being careful, being practical, reminding herself that circumstances could change, and that a man's stated intentions and his actual willingness to follow through were two different things, and that she had been disappointed before specifically and recently, and that she was a woman who learned from experience. All of that was true. She held all of it in one hand. In the other hand, she held 6 weeks of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said, who had not once looked at her and flinched, who had stood in a drive with Gerald Alderton and not stepped in front of her, but stood beside her, which was the more important thing. She said, "You know this town will talk. Even after Sunday they'll say it was convenient, that I needed the arrangement and you provided it." "They'll say that regardless," he said. "People who have decided on a story don't generally update it because the facts change." "You're not afraid of that," she said. "I'm afraid of a great many things," he said. "Gerald Alderton's opinion isn't one of them." She looked at him. "What are you afraid of?" I was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet of a man who had been asked an honest question and was going to give it an honest answer. "That I've spent 6 years learning to want nothing," he said, "and now I want something and I'm going to get it wrong." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Daniel, I have been told my entire life that I am too much and not enough in the same breath. Too large to be desirable. Not conventional enough to be acceptable. Too direct to be comfortable." She paused. "And I came here on a train with 31 cents and dried flowers from a man who couldn't even look me in the eye, and I was going to make something out of it anyway, because that's what I do. I make something out of what I'm given." I was watching her, very still. "You are not getting it wrong," she said. "You haven't gotten a single thing wrong since you found me on that platform." He held her gaze for a long beat. Then he said, "Is that a yes?" She said, "That's a yes." Sunday came with the particular cold clarity of late February in Kansas, the kind of morning where the air was sharp and the light was thin, and everything looked more itself than usual, more real, more precise, more exactly what it was. Clara wore her best dress. It was blue wool, bought second-hand in Lawrence 3 years ago, well made and well kept. She had altered it herself twice, as her weight had shifted with the seasons and the work, and it fit her properly now, which was all she had ever asked of clothes. She pinned her hair back with the 2 tortoise-shell combs that had been her mother's. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like herself. That was all. She looked like Clara Whitfield, who had come to Caldwell on a December night with nothing much, and had made something out of it anyway. She picked up the dried wildflowers from the windowsill. She set them back down. Some things you kept, and some things you moved past, and the trick was knowing which was which. She walked out into the kitchen. Daniel was at the table. He was wearing the good canvas shirt and a jacket she hadn't seen before, dark wool, well fitted, the kind of thing a man wore when he understood the day required it. He'd shaved, she noticed, and he'd left his hat on the hook by the door, which meant he'd thought about what the morning was and dressed for it deliberately in the same way she had. He stood when she came in. He did it without thinking, just stood automatically, and she knew from years of reading men that this particular kind of automatic gesture meant something different from the performed variety. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He looked at her for a moment. Just looked in that way he had thorough and unhurried taking in the whole of her without apology or adjustment. "You look well," he said. "So do you," she said. They walked to town together. He drove the wagon, which was practical because it was cold, and the church was 2 miles, and also because arriving together in a wagon was a statement, and they both understood that and said nothing about it because some statements were clearest when they were made without commentary. The church was already full when they arrived. Clara had not known it would be full, she had not thought to ask, had assumed it would be a quiet, functional thing, the Reverend and a few witnesses, and the words said honestly in a plain room. But Reverend Miles had apparently mentioned it, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas, had apparently decided that this was something they needed to see. She understood it as she walked through the door. This was not just a congregation. This was a verdict. She felt it, the specific weight of a room full of people who were looking at her and who had already decided what they were looking at, and were waiting to see if the evidence would confirm or deny their conclusion. She had felt this her entire life in different rooms, and she had become over the years skilled at carrying herself through it without letting the weight show. But she felt it, and she felt something else. Daniel's hand briefly at the small of her back. Not guiding her, just present. There and then, not there, the gesture of a man who was telling her something about where he stood without making a scene of it. She kept walking, chin level, eyes forward. Reverend Miles stood at the front of the room. He had a look of quiet, settled purpose. He had seen Clara thought a great many things in 11 years, and he had arrived at some understanding about what mattered and what didn't. Gerald Alderton was in the 3rd row. He was looking at Daniel with an expression that had moved past anger into something colder and more determined. The expression of a man recalibrating, looking for a new angle. Margaret sat beside him. She was looking at Clara. When their eyes met, Margaret gave a small, precise nod, the equivalent for Margaret Alderton of a standing ovation. Bon was beside his mother. He caught Clara's eye and looked immediately at his boots, which was the 13-year-old version of the same thing. They stood before Reverend Miles. The room was very quiet. "We are here this morning," Reverend Miles said, "because Daniel Kane has asked me to hear his intentions before this community, and because he has asked Clara Whitfield to stand beside him while he does." A murmur moved through the room. Not hostile, not exactly. More the sound of a room adjusting itself to the fact that something was happening that it had not quite expected. Reverend Miles looked at Daniel. Daniel turned to face Clara. He was not a man given to public performance, she had known that from the beginning. He was a private man by nature, careful with what he revealed and to whom. Standing in front of a church full of people who had opinions about both of them. Was she understood not comfortable for him? She could see the effort of it in the set of his jaw. He did it anyway. "Clara Whitfield came to Caldwell on Christmas night," he said, and his voice was low and level, directed at her but carrying to the room. "She came on a promise that wasn't kept. She sat alone on a platform in the snow, and she gave away the last of her food to a child who needed it more. And I've been paying attention to her ever since." He paused. "She's the most honest person I've met in a long time. She doesn't do anything for show. She does things because they're true, and because they're right, and because she has the particular kind of courage that doesn't announce itself." Another pause. "I'd like to build something with her, if she'll have me." The room was very still. Clara looked at him. At this man who had run a ranch alone for 6 years with Alice's absence built into every room, who had never in 6 years looked for a way out of the solitude, who had looked at her on a Christmas platform and seen not a problem to be solved, but a person worth knowing. She said, "I'll have you." And then, because she was Clara Whitfield, and she believed in honesty, and because the room was watching, and she had decided she was done managing other people's comfort. "I want this community to know that I came here with very little, and that this man gave me a great deal, not because I needed it, but because he believed I was worth the giving. I intend to be." She looked at the room. Not at Gerald Alderton. At the room. "I'm going to teach your children. I'm going to live at this ranch. I'm going to conduct myself honestly every day. And I'm going to trust that this community is capable of judging me by what I do not, by what someone has decided I look like." The silence that followed was the kind that could go either way. Then Mrs. Holt said from the fifth row in her flat-carrying boarding-house voice, "About time." Something broke in the room. Not everyone, not Gerald Alderton, whose face had gone to stone, but enough. Enough that it mattered. The trouble came 3 hours later. They were outside after the service in the cold, clear air, and Clara was talking to Margaret when she heard raised voices from the direction of the church steps. She turned. Daniel and Gerald Alderton. Gerald was not shouting. He was too controlled for that, too aware of the audience, but his voice had an edge that carried, and Daniel was standing very still in the way he stood when he had decided not to engage, but was not going to retreat. Clara excused herself and moved toward them. "You think this changes anything?" Gerald was saying. "You think standing up in front of Miles and making a speech is going to fix what you've been doing to this community?" "I haven't done anything to this community," Daniel said. "You've been harboring a woman of questionable—" "Gerald." Daniel's voice was quiet. Just his name, but the way he said it stopped Gerald mid-sentence. "I'm going to say this once. Clara Whitfield is going to be my wife. She is a better teacher than this school board deserves. She is an honest woman, and she has conducted herself with more dignity in 8 weeks than most people manage in a lifetime. Whatever argument you have with me about the East Pasture, about the water rights, about anything, it's between you and me. You leave her out of it." Gerald looked at him. Then at Clara, who had arrived at Daniel's side and was looking at Gerald Alderton with the calm, clear, patient expression of a woman who had been in this specific position before, in front of a person who had decided to use her to hurt someone else and had learned exactly what it required. "You're making a mistake," Gerald said to Daniel. "I've made mistakes," Daniel said. "This isn't one of them." Gerald looked between them. Clara could see him calculating the specific arithmetic of a man deciding whether he had enough to press further, or whether the room had shifted in a way that made pressing counterproductive. His eyes landed on Clara. "You think you've won something," he said. "I think," Clara said, "that I've been here 8 weeks, and I've taught your son long division and helped him understand that wanting to be a veterinarian isn't shameful. I think that's more useful than whatever it is we're doing right now." Gerald's face did something complicated. She watched the way the mention of Ben worked on him, not dissolving anything but finding a crack. "My son is none of your business," he said. "Your son is my student," she said. "Which makes him exactly my business, and I take that seriously." She held his gaze. "Mr. Alderton, I'm not your enemy. I understand that you have a dispute with Daniel that has nothing to do with me. I understand that I was a convenient angle. I'm asking you plainly to let it go. Not for my sake, for Ben's. Because that boy is going to be remarkable if someone lets him be, and right now, the person most in his way is the one who should be most in his corner." Gerald stared at her. She didn't look away. She didn't soften it. She just held it the way she held everything straight and present and without apology. He turned and walked away without answering. Clara stood in the cold and watched him go. Daniel said quietly beside her, "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," she said. "Because you were about to, and it lands differently coming from me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Does it?" "He doesn't care what you think of him," she said. "He might care what I think of his son." Daniel looked at her. The expression on his face was the open one, the one she'd been seeing more of, the one she'd stopped pretending she didn't notice. "Clara," he said. "Daniel." "I meant what I said in there," he said. "In front of the whole town, every word." "I know you did," she said. "You don't say things you don't mean. That's one of the first things I noticed about you." "What else did you notice?" he said. She looked at him. She considered being careful. She considered the specific habitual caution of a woman who had learned to measure out honesty in small quantities to avoid the particular pain of having given too much to someone who wasn't going to give it back. Then she decided she was finished being careful. She had been careful for 24 years. She had been careful all the way to a train platform in a snowstorm, and careful hadn't kept her warm. "I noticed," she said, "that you looked at me on that platform and saw a person, not a situation, not an inconvenience, not a category." She paused. "I noticed that you took your hat off before you spoke to me, which is a small thing, but it's the kind of small thing that tells you everything about a man." He was watching her with absolute attention. "And I noticed," she said, "that when I moved into your house you showed me the latch on the door, from the inside." She held his gaze. A man who shows a woman the latch on her door is a man who understands that she has been in situations where she needed one. That kind of understanding is rarer than it ought to be. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm sorry you've needed one." "I'm glad you understood that I might," she said. They stood together in the cold outside the church, and Caldwell moved around them. People talking, children running, the ordinary noise of a community on a Sunday morning. And Clara felt for the first time in a very long time not separate from it. Not watched from outside. Part of it, or beginning to be. The school board met again on Wednesday. Clara was not told in advance. She found out from Hector, who found out from Jim Hartwell's hired man, who had been present when Gerald called the meeting. By the time Clara knew, Daniel already knew, and had been to see Hartwell himself, and she was mildly but genuinely irritated about this, until she understood that Daniel had gone not to speak for her, but to ensure she was given the opportunity to speak for herself. "Hartwell says you can address the board before they vote," Daniel said when he came home. "If you want to." "Of course I want to," she said. He looked at her. "I told him you would." She looked back. "You're getting very good at predicting me." "You're very consistent," he said. "It's one of the things I value most about you." She almost said something. She caught it, considered it, and let it stay caught because some things were better said when there was more time, and this was not the night for it. "What time is the meeting?" she said. 7, he said. "Then I'll need to finish this lesson plan by 6, she said. She picked up her pen. "I'll need quiet." He went to the other side of the room and was quiet. She was aware of him across the room. Aware of him, the way she was always aware of him. Now the specific, inconvenient warmth of a person whose presence she had stopped being able to be neutral about. She kept her eyes on the lesson plan. She wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. At 10 to 6, she said without looking up, "Daniel. Clara. After Wednesday. After whatever happens at the meeting." She kept writing. "I want to talk about Alice." Silence from across the room. "Not because I'm troubled by her," she said. "Because she was important to you, and you were important to her, and that matters to me. I want to know her, as much as you can tell me." Another silence. Longer. Then quietly, "All right." She finished the lesson plan. She put down her pen. "All right," she said. "Let's go over what I'm going to say Wednesday." The school board meeting was in the back room of the feed store, which was where official Caldwell business happened. 7 men at a long table. Lamps on either end. A chair set to one side that was clearly for the person being addressed and was positioned to feel like exactly that. Clara sat in it without hesitation. She had prepared what she wanted to say. She had gone over it with Daniel the previous evening and refined it, stripping out everything that was defensive and keeping only what was true, because she had found that truth delivered plainly and without excess was harder to argue with than any defense she could construct. She looked at the 7 men at the table. At Gerald Alderton, who was looking at the surface of the table. At Jim Hartwell, who was looking at her with the steady, fair expression of a man who was going to make an honest decision. "Gentlemen," she said, "I've been teaching at Caldwell School for 8 weeks. In that time, my students have made measurable progress in arithmetic, reading, and writing. I can give you specific examples for each child if that would be useful. I have not had a single incident of conduct unbecoming. I have not missed a single day of school. I have worked without complaint in a building that needed significant repair, which has since been partially addressed. She paused. I have also agreed to marry Daniel Kane, which I understand is the actual subject of this meeting. Gerald's jaw tightened. She saw it. I am not going to ask you to approve of my personal life, she said. It isn't the school board's jurisdiction. What I am going to ask you is this, to tell me plainly whether you have any specific complaint about the quality of my teaching. Not about where I sleep. Not about who I intend to marry. About my teaching. She looked at each of them, one by one, without challenge, without performance. Just the plain, direct look of a woman who wanted an honest answer to an honest question. One by one, 5 of the 7 looked away first. Gerald Alderton looked at her and said, Your conduct outside the classroom reflects on the school. My conduct outside the classroom, she said, has been consistent with the conduct of a woman who came to this town with very little and built something through honest work. She met his gaze. I understand that you and Daniel have a history. I understand that I've been a useful angle in that history. I'm asking you, Mr. Alderton, to separate those things. Your disagreement with Daniel is between you and Daniel. My teaching is between me and these children, and it has been and it will continue to be what it should be. Gerald looked at her for a long, hard moment. She held it. She held it the same way she'd held everything since Christmas night, straight through, without flinching, with the particular quality of a woman who had decided that her dignity was not something that required anyone else's permission. Gerald looked away first. Jim Hartwell cleared his throat. Is there a motion to table the complaint? He said. Silence. Then, so moved, said the man to Hartwell's left. Seconded, said another. All in favor, Hartwell said. 5 hands went up. Gerald's did not. The man beside him did not either. 5-2. Motion carries, Hartwell said. He looked at Clara. Miss Whitfield, we're grateful for your time. She stood. She nodded to Hartwell. She did not look at Gerald Alderton. She walked out of the feed store. Daniel was waiting outside. He was leaning against the wagon with his arms folded and his hat low, the posture of a man who was calm on the outside, because he'd had years of practice being calm on the outside, and whose hands, she noticed, were not quite as relaxed as the rest of him. 5-2, she said. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then he straightened. You're all right, he said. I'm fine, she said. Then honestly, I'm better than fine. He looked at her. The open expression fully open now, not guarded by anything. It's over, he said. Gerald won't think it's over, she said. No, Daniel agreed. But it doesn't matter what Gerald thinks anymore. He held her gaze. Are you ready to go home? Home. The word landed in her chest with a specific weight that was not sadness, but was something that had lived alongside sadness for a long time, and was now separating from it. Yes, she said. They drove back in the dark, the wagon moving steadily through the February cold, and the sky above them was wide and clear and sharp with stars. And Clara Whitfield sat beside Daniel Kane on the wagon bench, and felt not for the first time since Christmas, but for the first time without reservation, that she had come to exactly the right place. She did not say this aloud. She was still in some ways a careful person. But she let herself feel it completely all the way down without qualification or defense, and that she thought was the beginning of something. 3 days later. Ben Alderton came to the schoolhouse early. She was at her desk when he appeared in the doorway 20 minutes before the others were due, holding his hat in his hands in the same way she'd seen Daniel hold his hat when he was about to say something he'd decided to say and wasn't sure how it would land. Miss Whitfield, he said. Ben, she said. Come in. He came in. He stood in front of her desk. He was 14, the age of a person who was too old to be managed and too young to manage himself, who existed in the exact uncomfortable position of knowing what he wanted and not yet having the tools to get it. My father came home Wednesday night, he said. She waited. He didn't say anything about the board, Ben said. He just came in and sat down for dinner and didn't talk. He paused. Then he asked me what we're studying in school right now. Clara kept her expression still. He's never asked that, Ben said. What did you tell him? She said. I told him we're doing fractions, Ben said. And that you explained them different than anyone else. That you said a fraction is just a question a number is asking about itself. He looked at his boots, then up at her. He said he said. It sounded like a good way to think about it. Clara looked at Ben Alderton. This serious, careful, quietly extraordinary boy who loved horses and hated fractions and was carrying the weight of a father who didn't know how to see him. Bon traite, she said. Your father is a complicated man, but he loves you. I believe that. He has a strange way of showing it, Ben said. Most people do, she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Mr. Kane told me last Saturday that I have the best natural instinct with horses he's seen in 20 years. He told me the same thing, Clara said. Something moved in Ben's face, something young and bright and not yet defended. Did he? He did, she said. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. You know that. Yes, Ben said. He put his hat back on the gesture of a boy who had come and said what he came to say, and was now returning to the business of being 14. I'm going to be a veterinarian, he said. It wasn't a wish. It was a statement. I know you are, she said. He nodded once. He went to his seat third row middle where he'd been for the past month. He took out his slate. He was ready before anyone else arrived. Clara turned back to her desk and allowed herself quietly and without ceremony to feel exactly how much this particular Tuesday morning mattered. She had not saved anyone. She had not performed anything grand. She had simply shown up every day and been exactly what she was, and let that be enough. It was enough. The other children arrived. The school day began, and somewhere across town on a Wednesday morning, Clara Whitfield understood that she had won not the school board meeting, not the argument with Gerald Alderton, but the longer, quieter thing. The thing she had come to Caldwell on a December night to find with 31 cents and dried flowers, and the specific, undefeated hope of a woman who had decided she was worth something and had been right. The wedding was on a Saturday in March, not a large wedding. Clara had not wanted large, had not wanted the particular performance of a large wedding, which required an audience, and an audience required managing, and she had spent enough of her life managing audiences. She wanted something true. Small and true, and exactly what it was. Reverend Miles, Mrs. Holt, Jim Hartwell and his wife, Hector, who stood in the back with his hat in both hands, and the expression of a young man who had decided to have feelings about this occasion and was doing his best to keep them off his face. Margaret Alderton, who came alone and sat in the front row and wore an expression of such composed, deliberate dignity that Clara understood it was an act of courage coming without Gerald coming at all. Bun Aldern came too. He slipped in just before it started, took a seat beside his mother, and looked at the floor. The way he looked at the floor when something mattered to him and he didn't know what to do with the mattering. Clara wore the blue wool dress. She had considered buying something new, had gone so far as to look at fabric at the general store, and had concluded that the blue dress was honest, and the blue dress fit her, and the blue dress had been with her since Lawrence, and that felt right. She pinned her mother's combs in her hair. She carried nothing. Daniel was waiting at the front of the room. He had worn the dark wool jacket again. He was standing the way he always stood, straight, unhurried, occupying exactly the space he occupied without apology or performance. And when she came through the door and he saw her, something happened in his face that she had not seen before. Not the almost smile, not the steady assessment. Something that was open all the way through, that had nothing careful about it, that was simply there. Plain and complete and entirely his. She walked toward him. Her hands were steady. Her chin was level. She was not nervous, she realized, and the absence of nervousness was itself startling. She had expected to be afraid, the way she had always been afraid in the moments that mattered. The old protective fear of a woman who had learned that wanting things was the first step toward losing them. She was not afraid. She was certain. Reverend Miles said the words. Daniel said his. Clara said hers plainly, directly, without performance, the same way she said everything. She looked at him when she said them, because she meant them, and she wanted him to see that she meant them, and she could tell from his face that he did see it, that he had always been able to see her clearly, and that this was the thing above every other thing that had made her certain. When Reverend Miles said they were married, Mrs. Holt said, "Finally," in the same flat, carrying voice she'd used at the church in February. And the small room did the thing small rooms did when something genuinely good happened in them. It relaxed all at once, like a breath let out. Daniel touched her face. Just briefly with the back of 2 fingers, so light it was almost not a touch at all. Then he said quietly, just for her, "Clara Kane." She looked at him. "Daniel Kane," she said back. Because it was his name, and she was saying it to him, and that was enough. The first week of marriage was ordinary. This was, Clara thought, the best possible thing it could have been. She taught on Monday. She came home and Daniel was already in from the range and had started coffee, which was new in the months of living in the house. She had always started the coffee, and the fact that he'd started it now meant something specific. Meant he was paying attention to her habits, the way she'd been paying attention to his. And she registered this without comment, and drank the coffee, and told him about Samuel's breakthrough with long division, which had involved a great deal of dramatic sighing before the breakthrough, and an expression of disbelief afterward that had made the whole class laugh. Daniel listened, the way he listened to everything completely, and without interruption, not waiting for his turn to speak, but they're actually present in the receiving of what she was saying. "He'll be all right," Daniel said when she finished. "He already is," Clara said. "He doesn't know it yet." Daniel looked at her. "You do that," he said. "See where people are going before they get there." "I see where they could go," she said. "That's different." "Is it?" She thought about it. "I think potential and destination are different things," she said. "Potential is everywhere. Destination is a choice." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Alice used to say that too. Not in those words, but that." It was the first time he'd said Alice's name in conversation without being asked. Clara looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup, and there was something in his face that was not grief anymore, or not only grief, but the more complicated thing that grief became when it had been long enough and enough good had happened alongside it. "Tell me something about her," Clara said. "Something ordinary." He thought for a moment. "She burned the biscuits every time," he said. "Every single time. She couldn't understand it. She was a good cook, everything else was fine. But biscuits." He shook his head slightly. "We had a running disagreement about whether it was the oven or her technique." "Which was it?" Clara said. "Her technique," he said. "But I never said so while she was alive." Clara looked at him. "Why not?" "Because she was proud of trying," he said. "And that was worth more than biscuits." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "She was lucky to have you." "I was lucky to have her," he said. He looked up. "I'm lucky now too." He said it simply, without decoration. The way he said things that were true. Clara held his gaze across the kitchen table. The worn table the coffee pot used 10,000 times. The cast iron pan on the wall, and felt the specific complete weight of what she had been given. Not just the room with the latch and the view of the barn. Not just the job kept and the school board voted down, and Gerald Alderton's face when she'd looked at him without flinching. All of it together, and underneath it all. This a man who told her she was lucky in the same sentence as Alice, who did not ask her to be separate from his past, or to pretend it hadn't happened, who understood that a life had to have room for everything it had actually contained. She said, "I burned the biscuits last week." He looked at her. He knew she hadn't. She made excellent biscuits. "I know," he said. "I'm telling you in advance," she said, "so you can practice your response." He looked at her for a long moment. Then Daniel Kane, who almost never smiled, smiled. Not adjacent to one. Not a thing that might become one in favorable conditions. A real one, complete and unguarded. And it changed his whole face, made him look younger and less solitary, and fully present in a way that she suspected very few people had ever seen. She filed it away carefully. It was hers, and she knew it. April brought mud and a letter. The mud was expected spring in Kansas, meant the roads turned to soup, and the ranch became an exercise in patience and dry boots. The letter was not expected, and it arrived on a Wednesday morning, addressed to Clara Kane, In handwriting she recognized immediately with a return address in Lawrence. It was from Arthur Finch. She read it at the kitchen table before Daniel came in from the barn. It was not long. It said that he had heard she had married. It said he hoped she was well. It said, and this was the part that surprised her, that she read twice to be sure she was reading it correctly, that he had been wrong to walk away on the platform, that he had known it within an hour, and hadn't had the courage to come back and say so, and that he thought she deserved to know that the failure had been entirely his. She folded the letter when she heard Daniel on the porch. He came in, saw her face, and said, "What happened?" She handed him the letter. He read it. She watched him read it, watched the expressions that moved across his face, which were in order: recognition, assessment, something controlled, and then something that was the very quiet equivalent of anger managed efficiently into stillness. He folded the letter and set it on the table. "How do you feel?" he said. She thought about it. "Smaller than I expected to feel," she said. "I thought if I ever got an apology from him, I'd feel something large, vindicated maybe, or angry. And instead I mostly feel that it was a long time ago," she said, "and that I came out of it considerably better than I would have if he hadn't walked away." Daniel looked at her. "Do you want to write back?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "There's nothing to say that isn't already said." She picked up the letter, folded it one more time. "He gave me dried wildflowers on a platform in a snowstorm and walked away. It was a terrible night, but it put me on that road at the right time to meet a man who took his hat off before he spoke to me." She looked at Daniel. "I don't have a complaint." He held her gaze. Then he said, "I'm going to take that hat off every time I speak to you for the rest of my life." She looked at him. "You're usually not wearing it indoors." "Then I'll put it on first," he said, "so I can take it off." She laughed. It came out before she'd decided to let it, clean and full and undefended, the laugh of a woman who had not laughed easily for a long time and was now apparently out of practice at stopping herself. Daniel watched her laugh with an expression that was simply and completely happy. It was a plain thing. It was the best thing she had ever seen on a human face. She took the letter outside and let it go in the burn barrel. She watched it take the flame and thought of Christmas night, the platform, the cold, the 31 cents. And then she thought of the kitchen table and the coffee and the story about Alice's biscuits and the smile she'd seen for the first time last week. She thought, "I would do the whole night again. I would do every hard thing that led here." She went back inside. The twist came in May, and Clara did not see it coming. She had learned by then the rhythms of the ranch, which days Daniel came in late, which problems with the herd were seasonal, and which required attention. How Hector operated best when given clear direction and latitude to execute it, and the specific way the house changed in the evenings when all three of them were in it, comfortable and unhurried, and each occupying their space without crowding anyone else's. She had also learned something she hadn't known to look for. She had learned that Daniel, who was meticulous about the ranch, who maintained accounts to the penny, and tracked every head of cattle and every acre of land with the careful attention of a man who had built something from very little and intended to keep it. Daniel Kane had been quietly extending credit to 3 families on the eastern edge of his property line for going on 2 years. She found out by accident. She had been organizing the desk in the study, not because Daniel had asked her to, but because she had been in there looking for a piece of paper and discovered that his filing system was, by his standards, remarkably chaotic, and she could not leave a chaotic filing system alone, any more than she could leave a cracked window latch. She found the ledger entries. She found the notes beside them, and she found folded into the back cover of the ledger 3 letters. She was not meant to see correspondence with the families in Daniel's spare plain hand, telling them to take the season they needed, that the account would hold, that he was not in a hurry. She was sitting at the desk with the letters when Daniel came in. He stopped. He looked at what she was holding. He did not look embarrassed exactly. More the look of a man whose private habits had been discovered, which was different from shame. "You weren't supposed to find those," he said. "Your filing system made it inevitable," she said. He came into the study. He sat in the chair across from the desk, his hat in his hands. "The Garfield family had a bad year," he said. "Fire took their north barn in June. Morrison's wife was sick 3 months. They couldn't work a full day. The Hendersons, the youngest boy, needed a doctor in Wichita. "How long have you been doing this?" she said. "It's not doing anything," he said. "It's keeping an account." "Daniel," she said. "How long?" Howe was quiet for a moment. "Since the second year after Alice," he said. "The Garfields helped me that winter. I wasn't managing well. They brought food and didn't ask questions." He paused. "People who help you when you're not managing don't usually announce it. I figured returning the favor the same way was the right approach." Clara looked at him. She thought about a man running a ranch alone for 6 years, quietly holding accounts open for families who needed it, never mentioning it to anyone, never looking for the acknowledgement. "Does anyone know?" she said. "Jim Hartwell suspects," he said. "He's discreet." "Gerald Alderton doesn't know," she said. Not a question. "No," Daniel said, "and I'd prefer to keep it that way." She set the letters down carefully. "If Gerald knew," she said slowly, "he'd find a way to use it." "Yes," Daniel said. "He'd call it leverage. He'd say I was buying loyalty." "Is he still?" She paused. "Are you still worried about him?" Daniel looked at her steadily. "Gerald is a man who doesn't forget," he said. "And he's had a quiet 2 months, which generally means he's thinking." Clara absorbed this. She had spent the spring in the comfortable, dangerous assumption that the school board vote had settled things. 2 months of ordinary life had a way of making you believe the ordinary would continue. "Tell me what you know," she said. "I don't know anything specific," he said. "I know his character. I know that losing the board vote publicly in front of the town is the kind of thing Gerald doesn't absorb. He reroutes." He paused. "I'm watching." "So am I," she said. He looked at her. "I know you are," he said. It was not a compliment and not a reassurance. It was just the plain acknowledgement of who she was, which was better than both. She picked up the letters again, set them in order, folded them neatly, and put them back exactly where she'd found them. "The filing system still needs work," she said. "I know," he said. "I'll help you with it Saturday," she said. "All right," he said. She stood up. Then she stopped. "Daniel, those 3 families." She looked at him. "They're lucky." He shook his head slightly. "They'd have found another way." "Maybe," she said. "But they didn't have to." She held his gaze. "I didn't have to either. You keep doing that, making it so people don't have to find the hard way when there's a better one available." He looked at her with that expression, the fully open one. "I learned from the best," he said. She was almost to the door when she said, "Alice." "You," he said. She walked out of the study before he could see her face do what it was doing. She stood in the hallway for exactly 15 seconds, her hand flat against the wall, feeling the warmth of a house that had been built for more and had finally, after a long time, become more. Then she went to start dinner. Gerald Alderton made his move on a Thursday evening in late May. He did not come to the ranch. That Clara thought would have been too direct for Gerald, who preferred angles to fronts. Instead, a man arrived at the schoolhouse at the end of the school day. Not Gerald himself, but a man from the county seat 40 miles east, who introduced himself as Mr. Briggs, and who carried a leather case and the particular expression of a person executing someone else's plan. He said he was from the county education office. He said there had been a formal complaint lodged regarding the school in Caldwell. He said the complaint alleged improper use of school funds and materials, specifically that the school teacher had been using school supplies for personal purposes, and that the school board had suppressed an investigation. Clara looked at him. She had the letter of complaint in her hand within 2 minutes of him presenting it, and she read it completely before she said a word, because she was a woman who understood that the first thing you did when someone presented you with a weapon was understand its exact dimensions. The complaint was signed by Gerald Alderton. It was detailed, specific, and almost entirely constructed from things that had innocent explanations that Gerald had arranged to make look like something else. The chalk she'd bought from her own salary to replace what the school couldn't supply. The paper she'd brought from the ranch. The afternoon she'd let Ben Alderton use the school stove to warm food for the Morrison child who'd come to school with nothing to eat. Every true thing reconfigured. "I'll need you to respond to these allegations," Mr. Briggs said. Not unkindly. He was a bureaucrat, not a combatant. He was doing a job. "The county office has to investigate formal complaints." "I understand," Clara said. "I'd like to come back tomorrow morning," he said. "With the school board." "Fine," she said. "Come at 8. The children won't arrive until 8:30. She looked at him. "Mr. Briggs, did the person who filed this complaint tell you about the school board vote in February?" He shifted slightly. "He mentioned it, yes." "Did he mention why the vote went against him?" Another shift. "He presented his account." "I imagine he did," she said. She folded the complaint and handed it back. 8 o'clock tomorrow. She walked the 2 miles to the ranch in 20 minutes, which was faster than her usual pace, and she was aware that she was walking fast and did not slow down because the speed was honest. Daniel was on the porch when she came up the drive. He could read her from 100 yards, she'd learned. He stood up as she came through the gate. She told him everything. Fast complete without softening it. He listened without interrupting. His face was very still. Then he said, "Come inside." They sat at the kitchen table. He poured coffee. She didn't drink it. "Gerald found a way to go over the school board," she said. "Yes," he said. "The complaint is constructed carefully," she said. "Everything in it is technically true in a way that requires explanation to be understood correctly. That's worse than a lie. A lie you can disprove. A true thing arranged wrong takes longer." "Yes," he said. He was thinking. She could feel him thinking the back first way, checking what was real before deciding what to do. "We need documentation," she said. "Everything I've bought with my own salary, I have receipts. The paper I brought from here, I can establish that." "The Morrison child." She stopped. "Ben." Daniel looked up. "Bun was there," she said. "He helped me warm the food. He knows it was the Morrison child who was hungry, and he knows the supplies were mine, and he knows—" She paused. "I can't ask Ben to testify against his father." "No," Daniel said. "You can't. But if he came forward on his own," she said carefully, "that would be different." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "Don't put that on him," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not going to. I'm just—" She looked at the table. "I'm thinking about what Gerald doesn't know he's done." "What do you mean?" She looked up. "Gerald built this complaint on a story where I'm a woman who takes advantage of the situation she's been given, who came here needing something and used the school as a way to get more of it." She held Daniel's gaze. "But every single thing he's cited as evidence of that is something I did for someone else. The chalk for the children, the paper for the children, the food for the Morrison boy." She paused. "He's made a very detailed record of every time I helped someone, and he's put it in a document that he's presented to the county office as a complaint." Daniel looked at her. She could see him arriving at what she was arriving at. "He's made the case for me," she said. "If you can show it clearly enough," Daniel said. "I can," she said. "I need one night to organize it." She stood up. She was calm now, not the surface calm she used when she was managing something, but the real kind, the kind that came from understanding the problem well enough to believe it was solvable. "I need paper and lamp oil and your desk for the evening." He stood up. He went to the study. He brought her paper and moved the lamp and cleared the desk and left her there with everything she needed. At the door he said, "Clara." She looked up. "You're going to be fine," he said. "Not a performance, not comfort, just accurate." "I know," she said, and went to work. Mr. Briggs came at 8 the next morning with Jim Hartwell and 2 other board members. Gerald was not present. His absence felt louder than his presence would have. Clara had 12 pages of documentation on the desk in front of her. Receipts, dates, names, the specific account of every item Gerald had cited, and the true explanation of each one. She had also in the back of the stack 3 letters, one from Margaret Alderton, delivered by early morning, written in Margaret's controlled, emphatic hand, stating clearly what she had witnessed at the school and in the community regarding Miss Whitfield's Mrs. Kane's character and conduct. One from Mrs. Holt, 2 sentences characteristically direct. One from Jim Hartwell himself, which Clara had not requested, and which he slid onto the table when he arrived without meeting her eyes, because Jim Hartwell was a man who did things because they were right, and didn't require acknowledgement for doing them. She presented her documentation to Mr. Briggs. He read it. He asked 2 questions. She answered both. Then Hartwell said, "Mr. Briggs, I want to be clear about the context of this complaint. The individual who filed it has a documented history of using formal processes to pursue a personal dispute with Mrs. Kane's husband. The school board investigated these allegations in February and voted 5-2 to dismiss them. The same concerns repackaged for the county office are now before you." Briggs looked at Hartwell. He looked at Clara. He looked at the 12 pages. He closed his leather case. "I'll need a week to file my report," he said. "But I want to say, Mrs. Kane, that the documentation you've provided is thorough." "Thank you," she said. "I have one question that isn't in my official capacity," he said. He was a slight man, bureaucratic in posture, but his eyes were thoughtful. "How long have you been teaching?" 4.5 years, she said. "In that time," he said, "has anyone ever filed a complaint about your teaching?" "No," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane," he said. He left. Clara sat at the schoolhouse desk after they were all gone in the 20 minutes before her students arrived, and she looked at the 12 pages of documentation, and she thought about Gerald Alderton, who had spent 5 months trying to move her, who had found every angle and pressed it, who had used her circumstances, and her appearance, and her living arrangement, and now her teaching itself, and who had, in doing so, produced a record of every small good thing she had done since Christmas night. She thought, I don't know if that's justice or irony. Probably both. Samuel arrived first, as he always did, and sat in the seat. He'd long since moved to front row, directly in front of the chalkboard, and looked at her with the frank, serious face of a 7-year-old who had decided she was worth trusting. "Good morning, miss." He caught himself. He had been working on this. "Good morning, Mrs. Kane." "Good morning, Samuel," she said. He beamed. The front tooth that had been missing in January had come in crooked, which gave his face a lopsided, endearing precision that she expected would stay with him into adulthood and suit him very well. The others arrived. Ben Alderton, 3rd row slate ready before the others had their coats off. The Morrison children. 2 of them, now the younger sibling having joined the school in April, in the middle rows. 12 children. Some of them difficult, and some of them easy, and all of them real in the specific, irreducible way that children were real before the world had finished telling them who to be. She picked up the chalk. Briggs's report came in 8 days. He found no grounds for the complaint. The documentation was clear. He noted in the formal language of a county official that the concerns raised appeared to reflect a mischaracterization of normal educational practice and that no further action was warranted. He sent a copy to the school board and a copy to the county records office. Gerald Alderton received his copy on a Friday afternoon. Clara knew because Margaret came to the schoolhouse on Friday evening with a composed expression that contained underneath it the specific quality of a woman who had made a decision and was at peace with it. "He read it," Margaret said. "How did he take it?" Clara said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He sat with it for a long time," she said. Then he asked Ben to come and sit with him. She looked at her hands. "I don't know what they said." Ben came out an hour later and went to feed the horses, which is what he does when something has moved him and he doesn't want to show it. Clara looked at Margaret. "How are you?" she said. Margaret met her eyes. It was a direct question, and Margaret was a woman who gave direct answers when she trusted the person asking. "I'm tired," she said. "I've been tired for a long time. Gerald he is what he is. But I think—" She stopped. "I think this may have been the end of it. This particular campaign." She paused again. "He's proud, but he's not stupid. He understands when a position is untenable." "Do you want it to be the end?" Clara said. Margaret looked at her with something that was complicated and honest, and perhaps more than she'd intended to reveal. "I want my son to become who he's going to become," she said, "without his father spending all his energy on the wrong things." A pause. "I want a husband who asks Ben to sit with him because he wants to know his son, not because he's lost a fight and needs somewhere to put the feeling." "That might happen," Clara said. "It might," Margaret said. "People change, slowly, when they have reason to." She stood. She smoothed her coat. "You're a good teacher, Clara." "You're a good mother, Margaret," Clara said. They looked at each other across the schoolhouse, these two women who had started as a warning and a warning receiver and had arrived somehow at something honest between them. Margaret left. Clara sat alone in the schoolhouse until the lamp oil ran low, and she let herself feel the full cumulative weight of the past 5 months. Christmas night and the platform and the 31 cents. Mrs. Holt's hands folding her dress. Daniel taking his hat off before he spoke to her. The school board and Gerald's face and Ben Alderton's face. And the morning the Morrison child had eaten warm food in this room and looked up with the expression of a child who had not expected kindness and received it anyway. She blew out the lamp and locked the schoolhouse and walked home in the May evening, and the air was warm for the first time since she'd arrived in Caldwell, and she could hear the land settling into itself around her, the way land did in spring, and she thought about the particular quality of ordinary that she had been told was not available to her, and she thought, here it is, right here. I am walking inside it. She told Daniel that night. He listened. She talked for longer than she usually talked because it was May, and she was tired in the specific way of someone who had been careful for a long time, and the carefulness was finally lifting, and when she was done, she felt not lighter. That was the wrong word, but more complete. Like a sentence that had been missing its last word and had finally found it. Daniel said, "It's over." "This part," she said. He looked at her. "Is there another part?" She thought about it. "Gerald won't apologize," she said. "He'll stop, but he won't apologize. And there will be people in this town for a while who'll remember what he said and not remember that it was wrong." She paused. "That's just what it is. I can live with that." "Can you?" he said. Not doubting, just asking. "I've been living with versions of it my whole life," she said. "People who've decided what I am before they know me. People who look at me and see only the obvious thing and miss everything underneath." She looked at him. "But I've also been alive long enough to know that the people who matter eventually see it. The right ones do." She held his gaze. "You did." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. He did it the same way he did everything, without ceremony, without performance, as a simple and complete fact. "I've been thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the East Room," he said. "The one that gets the morning light." She waited. "I've been thinking it would make a good classroom," he said. "If there were ever children who needed somewhere to learn in the evenings. Families who can't get their children to the schoolhouse. People who'd like to read, but never had the chance." She looked at him. "You've been thinking about this for a while." "Since April," he said. "Since you told me about the Morrison children, the younger one joining late, losing a whole term." He paused. "Seems like there ought to be more options." Clara looked at the man across the table. This quiet, private, careful man who had spent 6 years giving people options without announcing it, who had kept accounts open and stocked shelves in the dark, and stood on a platform at Christmas and done the arithmetic on a problem and offered a solution without fanfare, and she felt something that was larger than gratitude and quieter than joy and more permanent than either. "Yes," she said. "Yes, we'll do it," he said. "Or yes, you'll think about it." "Yes, we'll do it," she said. "Starting in June once the term ends." She looked at him. "We'll need paper and chalk, and the lamp oil situation in that room is going to need addressing." "I'll see to the lamp oil," he said. "I'll see to the paper," she said. They sat at the table. Outside, the May evening was settling toward dark, the kind of dark that came slowly in spring, not falling, but deepening. The house was warm. The coffee pot was on. Somewhere in the barn, Hector was finishing the evening work with the unhurried efficiency that was entirely his own, and somewhere on the eastern edge of the property, the Garfield family was getting in from their fields, and somewhere in town, Ben Alderton had gone to feed horses after sitting with his father for an hour, and Margaret Alderton was tired, but perhaps not quite as tired as before. Clara thought about Christmas night. The platform, the snow, the moment before Daniel had spoken, the last moment of that particular life, the one before this one. She had 31 cents. She had dried flowers from a man who couldn't look at her. She had no room and no money, and a town full of people who had already decided what they saw. She had been 24 years old, and she had decided, not loudly, not dramatically, not in any way that would have looked like courage from the outside, she had decided to stay. To not run back to Lawrence. To make something out of what she'd been given, which was almost nothing, which was a cold night and a stranger who took his hat off before he spoke. She was still here. 5 months later, and she was still here. And the something she had made out of almost nothing was this: the worn table and the coffee pot and the man across it, and the 12 children, and the East Room with the morning light, and the town that had tried her and not broken her, and was beginning slowly in the way of towns to understand what it had. Daniel said, "What are you thinking about?" She said, "Christmas night." He said, "The platform." "Yes," she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, I almost didn't stop. She looked at him. "I'd been in town for the shipment that wasn't there," he said. "I was already on my way back to the wagon. I saw you on the bench. I kept walking." He paused. "And then I stopped." "Why?" she said. He looked at her across the table. "Because you were giving that biscuit away," he said. "And it was the last one you had. And I thought, I don't know what I thought. I thought that was the kind of thing that didn't deserve to go unnoticed." Clara looked at him. She had known in some way that it had been the biscuit. She had known from the way he'd told her on the platform why he'd stopped. Not pity, not a man performing goodness, but a man who had seen something true about her in one moment and wanted to know more of it. She said, "I'm glad you stopped." He said, "So am I." Simple, complete. They finished the coffee. They said goodnight with the ease of two people who had learned each other's rhythms and found them compatible, which was its own kind of miracle. The quiet domestic kind that didn't announce itself, but built day by day into something that held. Clara went to her room. Their room now had been for 2 months, with the window that looked toward the barn and the view of the morning light. And she sat on the edge of the bed and she looked at the windowsill where the dried wildflowers had been and were not anymore. She had put them in the burn barrel in April, the same morning she'd burned Arthur Finch's letter. She did not need them anymore. She had kept them for what they represented: the decision on the platform, the choice to stay, and she had stayed, and the decision had become a life, and you did not need to keep the marker once you'd arrived at the place it pointed to. She thought, "I am exactly where I am supposed to be, not where the world said she was supposed to be, not where Arthur Finch's failure to show up had suggested she was headed. Not where Gerald Alderton's 6 months of maneuvering had tried to put her. Where she was supposed to be. In a house built for more, that was finally more. In a town that had tried to define her and found her impossible to contain. In a life that was ordinary in every way she had once believed was unavailable to her. The morning coffee and the lesson plans and the worn table and the man who took his hat off before he spoke. She thought about the East Room with the morning light and the children who would sit in it starting in June, and the accounts that would be quietly kept, and the spring that had come to Caldwell. The way spring always came, indifferent to the winter that preceded it, simply arriving because it was time.